Chapter 183, Having Meat in the Army, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Both Xiao Yuhong and Captain Guo's gazes turned in unison to He Changdi. He Changdi looked up with a stiff expression, his deep eyes drew their attention, but screamed his innocence. Zhong Mai awkwardly coughed into his fist. Embarrassed, he said, "Captain, I was a little too hasty with my words. The meat I mentioned was something that Zhixiang's wife sent to him via messenger. Life was tough out here in the border troops. Even a captain wouldn't be able to eat meat more than once a month out here. If someone wanted some, they would have to hunt it themselves out in the plains, and that was only when they were on a rare vacation. However, with the arrival of winter, the animals were all in hibernation. It was getting harder and harder to find anything to hunt. Suffering from meat withdrawal was an all too common problem out here amongst the northern border troops. The troops did not maintain contact with the Tuhun or the nomadic barbarians, and they didn't raise any livestock in their camp either. The amount of meat available to them was pitiful. Zhong Mai shared a tent with He Changdi, and usually took good care of his junior. Big brother Zhong was older than He Changdi by a whole decade, and had already been in the army for about that long as well. He had participated in countless battles and was Captain Guo's most trusted subordinate. He had much experience to share, but his years in the army had left old wounds on his body, so his health wasn't as good as the others. Furthermore, Liangju had just entered winter. After sweating it out on the training grounds and getting hit by a blast of cold wind, coupled with the aching of his old wounds because of the chill, Zhong Mai had caught a cold. It had unfortunately manifested in a high fever, leaving him bedridden. The old doctor in camp had come over to take a look. All he had done was some acupuncture, and then had prescribed some medicine. As for food and water, that was all left to the patient's means to supply. When Captain Guo was notified of his situation, he ordered the army cooks to send a pot of white rice porridge to Zhong Mai. Captain Guo had had nothing better to offer. Since He Changdi shared a tent with Zhong Mai, he took up the responsibility of caring for him. As he watched Zhong Mai grow ever paler and skinnier due to his illness and old wounds, He Changdi quietly took out the translucent shredded beef that Chu Lian had sent to him. He scooped some out of the jar and placed it into Zhong Mai's porridge. When the bedridden Zhong Mai saw the shredded beef covered in oil sitting on top of his usually plain porridge, his eyes went completely wide. Zhong Mai didn't stand on courtesy with He Sanlang, and quickly wolfed down his porridge in only a few big gulps. After he was done, he wiped his mouth and pointed at the bowl, asking with surprise, "Where did that come from?" The normally taciturn He Sanlang then said, "My wife sent it over." Zhong Mai laughed out loud, which only ended up making him cough. "Since your wife sent it to you, you must have eaten much of it in the past. Why don't you leave the rest of it for your big brother here? It'll be good for my recovery." Although He Sanlang looked calm and composed, Zhong Mai still hadn't expected him to be such a tough nut to crack. He Sanlang refused to answer him. In the end, he only gave Zhong Mai that shredded beef a few more times. When Zhong Mai had recovered, he had searched through every nook and cranny of that tent, but it was pointless. He couldn't find where He Changdi had hidden that little jar of translucent shredded beef. Zhong Mai could only shake his head and smile. When he had overheard that kid Xiao Yuhong talking about eating meat, Zhong Mai had simply mentioned He Changdi's store of meat casually. Although Captain Guo raised his troops with love, he trained them very strictly. He might seem coarse and open-hearted on the surface, but he actually wasn't too easy to get close to. Zhong Mai had been serving under this superior officer of his for many years, so he understood him a lot more than Xiao Yuhong and He Changdi did. Right now, though Captain Guo called these two kids his brothers, they weren't all that important to him on the inside. In order to soften the steel walls of Captain Guo's heart, some small tricks were needed. For example, this small matter of eating meat. Zhong Mai had seen He Changdi's ability. He came from a good background and had proven that he had both ambition and the talent to back it. He was also a good kid inside. Unfortunately, perhaps since it was his first time in the army, he still fell a little short when it came to interacting with others. Zhong Mai didn't know why, but he guessed that it might have been due to how he grew up when he was a child. That kid liked to keep a blank expression, although half of it was usually hidden by his full beard, It was inevitable that the combination of Changdi's appearance and attitude would give a bad first impression. When he had first started interacting with Changdi, Zhongmai hadn't really liked him. He had toiled for 10 years to get to this position of lieutenant, while Changdi had gotten in just by a letter from Prince Jin. However, after interacting with him more, he had slowly begun to approve of this young man. When he had fallen sick, Changdi had taken very good care of him despite his cold expression. From his clumsy actions, Zhongmai could tell that Changdi had never really taken care of someone before. It was then that Zhongmai had set down his initial misgivings and fully accepted this junior of his. He had come out now with the intention of helping Changdi out. Xiao Yuhong's eyes were alight. He quickly moved up to Changdi and stared at him with wide eyes. "Brother you really have meat." Although he spoke with some degree of yearning, he didn't ask for it outright. Still, Xiao Yuhong's desire was visible. His drool was about to drip out of his mouth. Captain Guo didn't press Changdi at all. Instead, he continued eating the hard wheat pancake in his bowl. He looked up with a smile and shot Changdi a glance. Zhongmai was starting to regret trying to help this blockhead out, seeing as he hadn't realized what he was supposed to do. He kicked the wooden stool under Changdi and said, "You stupid brat, what are you blanking out here for? It's just something your wife sent you. It's fine if you couldn't bear to let me eat it, but now you're even refusing to serve it to the captain." Changdi pressed his lips together and stood up. He bowed respectfully towards Captain Guo and said, "Please wait for a moment, Captain." Changdi returned soon enough carrying a small jar. He placed it on the table and opened the lid. The unique smell of pickled beef drifted out and filled the room. "Captain, it's all here now. Please try it." Changdi ordered someone to bring another bowl. He poured the remaining half of the translucent shredded beef into it. Chapter 184, Having Meat in the Army, 4. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. Captain Guo used his chopsticks to pick some up, and took an experimental bite. After savoring the taste, his eyes lit up and he praised, "It's good. Sister-in-law must be a really good cook." After saying so, he used his chopsticks to point at Changdi. "You lucky brat, you married a good wife. You were crazy enough to come all the way out here to the northern border, but not only did your wife not blame you, she even sent you something good to eat. I heard that you came out here just a few days after getting married, too." Xiao Yuhong hadn't heard of this news. He had been intently listening to this juicy piece of gossip while shoveling the shredded beef into his mouth, and didn't even bother to swallow before noisily asking, "Brother what's wrong? Is sister-in-law not pretty enough for you?" Captain Guo harumphed. "Not pretty. So what if she's not pretty? As long as she can manage the household and give birth to a few sons, she's a good wife. Besides, I heard that he married a legitimate daughter from House Ying." When Xiao Yuhong received a sudden warning glare from Zhongmai, he abruptly came to a realization. The captain's wife was an ugly woman, but was deeply respected by the captain. She had also given birth to a fair amount of good sons and daughters for him. Xiao Yuhong came from a common family, but he still knew this much from listening to his mother and sister's gossip sessions from before. That was also why he knew that, although House Ying was on the decline, their ladies had the reputation of being exceptionally fertile. Furthermore, their looks were all top-notch. His wife was most likely not the reason that brother he had left his home in such a hurry. Xiao Yuhong knew that he had stepped on a landmine with his careless words, so he stopped talking and buried his head in his bowl of meat. From the side, Zhongmai tried to smooth the dispute over. "Captain's right. In the future when we return to the capital, we definitely have to go to the captain's estate and visit sister-in-law." It was only then that Captain Guo was satisfied. He continued pointing at Changdi as he lectured him. "Since you've come out already and you can't disobey army orders, you won't be able to return home for quite some time. Still, you can't keep your head in the sand. You left a young wife back at home, you heartless bastard. She's living like a widow, but she hasn't forgotten to send you packages even with how you've treated her. If you have time, make sure you send more letters back home. And when you have the money, don't forget to buy some local specialties and send them back to your wife and family." Compared to how he usually addressed his brothers on the training grounds, There was an additional trace of sincerity in Captain Guo's tone. The way he was pointing out Changdi's wrongs seemed more like an older brother earnestly lecturing a younger family member for their own good. Zhong Mai's smile widened a little upon hearing this. Changdi also stopped being a block of wood and immediately stood up to bow deeply towards Captain Guo in thanks for his teachings. He could also feel that he had become much closer to Captain Guo thanks to this small jar of translucent shredded beef. Changdi stared at the empty jar with mixed feelings in his heart. In the middle of this brotherly atmosphere, Xiao Yuhong, who had been acting like a backdrop up till now, pointed at the bowl of shredded beef and mumbled, "Brothers, if you're not going to eat, this little brother is going to eat it all." Right after he finished speaking, everyone's chopsticks shot towards the bowl. Now that everyone had joined the fray, the bowl was quickly emptied. When there was only a thin layer of beef left, Captain Guo glared at Changdi and said, "What are you still eating for? Your wife made this, so you must have eaten tons of this before. And yet you still have the face to keep fighting with us." This time, Changdi was much more thick-skinned. He scooped up another piece with his chopsticks and, with nary a change in his expression, he said in a low voice, "I left my home just a few days after getting married. This is my first time eating my wife's cooking, so why can't I eat more of it?" Zhong Mai patted Changdi's shoulder and burst out into loud laughter. "Well, look who's become a miser now. That small bowl of shredded beef wasn't enough when shared between 4 people. When the bowl was finally empty, none of them was satisfied. In the end, Xiao Yuhong poured the remaining scraps and oil into his own bowl to mix in with the porridge and fill his stomach. After that meal, Xiao Yuhong stuck close to Changdi. "Brother when is sister-in-law going to send more things over?" Changdi's gaze was solidly stuck to the ground. He was truly beginning to regret giving them that taste of beef. Since the beef was so precious to him, he had only eaten small bits of it each time he had taken it out. If he had known that this day would come, he would have definitely eaten his fill and saved himself from heartbreak. However, he hadn't revealed all his cards. He hadn't taken out the beef and pork jerky that Chu Lian had sent him along with the shredded beef. When he heard this brat Xiao Yuhong asking for more, Changdi looked up and stared coldly at him, thinking in his heart, "My wife didn't cook this for a stinky man like you. Dream on." Xiao Yuhong awkwardly rubbed his nose. He was inwardly bubbling with frustration. Brother he seemed easy to get along with normally, so why was he being so stingy now? Xiao Yuhong was determined. In the future, he definitely had to marry a wife from House Ying who could cook well. When they finished their meal, the group began to idly chat. Due to this sudden event, they had become much closer when compared to before. As they were speaking, there was a sudden burst of commotion from the outside of their small tent. Chapter 185, Lucky Star 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Help! Someone fainted. Get the doctor. They weren't too far from the tent where the incident had happened, so Captain Guo led Changdi and the others to the area. After they finally managed to squeeze past the crowd, Captain Guo squatted down by one of the unconscious soldiers and sternly asked, "What happened here?" Replying to Captain, "Zhao Qi seems to be having a bad fever." Captain Guo reached out to touch the forehead of the soldier, and it was indeed feverish to the touch. The soldier seemed dazed from the fever. He started to rave like a madman. The crowd waited for a moment, but the doctor still hadn't arrived. Captain Guo's brows furrowed tightly together. He was about to shout the order again when the soldier who had gone off to get the doctor returned in a panic. Without wasting any more time, the soldier said, "Captain, the doctor already departed for the left wing. He's not in camp right now." "What?" Captain Guo punched the ground in frustration, causing a dull thud to ring out from the muddy earth. Captain Guo was part of the army's right wing, and though the majority of the right wing were members of the cavalry, he was a member of the vanguard. Out here in the border camps, he was at loggerheads with Captain Jiao Jiangwei of the army's left wing. Changdi saw that the soldier's face was already flushed red from the fever and couldn't help but notice how pitiful he looked. He stepped forward and said to the angry Captain Guo, "Captain, let me take a look." Changdi had read a few medical books before. In his previous life, when he had been wandering across the plains, he had learned some folk remedies from Ah Ma, the barbarian woman. Currently, He had with him some of the commonly used Chinese medicines that Chu Lian had sent over. They could probably be used to ease some of the soldier's pain, at least for now. He knelt by the soldier's side and first checked his pulse before opening his eyelids and checking his tongue. Following that, Changdi pulled a small, finely detailed pouch out of his clothes. He took out a honey-colored pill and fed it to the soldier, but the soldier's mouth was too dry so he couldn't swallow the pill. Changdi then took out a small gourd from his waist, and when he opened it, a special aroma began to drift out, the dry, sweet smell of alcohol. As the aroma of alcohol filled the air, some of the old alcoholics amongst the troops deeply inhaled, sinking into the thick and sweet smell of the wine. Changdi didn't care about the others' expressions. He only tipped a small mouthful into the soldier's mouth. Next, he quickly stoppered up the gourd and hung it back at his waist. Under the fading light of the setting sun, the soldiers saw Changdi feed the feverish soldier some thick, light purple liquid. The swig of wine was finally able to wash down the pill in the soldier's mouth. After doing all this, Changdi turned to a few soldiers near him and said, "He should be fine now. Take him back to his tent, he should recover after a good night's rest." Captain Guo patted Changdi's shoulder. "I didn't think that Zhixiang would know how to diagnose illnesses. That soldier has you to thank for today. However, what wine did you feed him just now? Someone ill shouldn't be drinking alcohol." Changdi stood up and made a slight bow to Captain Guo. "The soldier just now was merely a bit feverish due to a cold. The pill I gave him was some medicine from a store in the capital. As for the wine, it wasn't a very strong one, just some grape wine that was sent to me. Grape wine had antibacterial properties that could fight the bacteria from the cold." Although Changdi didn't know anything about the science behind it, he had seen an old traveling doctor use it as a remedy in his past life. Thus, he had given the soldier a mouthful of grape wine just as he had seen the doctor do back then. Well, you little brat, you've kept all sorts of good things from us." Before Captain Guo could think of a way to get the grape wine from Changdi, a deep, loud voice boomed, "Grape wine? Who here has the grape wine? Hand it over immediately." Captain Guo froze. Upon regaining his senses, he quickly got up to welcome their unexpected guest. "General, what business has brought you here?" The guest was dressed in silver armor. He had a white beard and looked a little skinny, but he was full of vigor from head to toe. His eyes were especially bright and full of life. Chapter 186, Lucky Star, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. The Duke of Lu, Great General Qian, harumphed. "Why? Am I not allowed to be here? Who said there was grape wine here? Bring it out." Captain Guo quickly shot a look at Changdi, who stiffened for a moment before stepping forward. He bowed towards Great General Qian before taking the gourd of wine off his waist and handing it over, though not without some hesitation. Great General Qian didn't really have much that he liked, except for wine. Although the northern border troops were only given rough fare to eat, as the highest-ranking commander there, General Qian was different from the common soldiers. At every meal, he could still afford to have a few cups of wine, though it wasn't the best quality. This old alcoholic Great General Qian was very sensitive to the smell of alcohol. Just now, he had been attracted to this area by that elusive smell of wine in the air, and he had happened to overhear Captain Guo and Changdi's conversation. It was rare to find grape wine in the Great Wu dynasty as they mostly produced sorghum wines. The grape wine of this era was pretty much like what Changdi had seen in his previous life, and most of them were made as medicinal wines. Even in the capital, there were very few people who had the opportunity to taste grape wine before, never mind the folks of this desolate border city. The wine-lover General Qian had seen all sorts of wines in his life, but this was his first time seeing grape wine. He immediately took off the stopper on the gourd and took a sniff right in front of Changdi and the other soldiers. The sweet, crisp smell of the wine tickled Great General Qian's senses. He wasn't in any hurry to taste it, so he closed the gourd again and hung it at his waist. General Qian then pointed at Changdi and turned to Captain Guo to ask, "Who is this child, and when did he enter the army?" Captain Guo hadn't thought that General Qian would ask for personal details about the provider of the wine. After a slight moment of surprised hesitation, He shot a look at He Changdi, indicating that he should introduce himself. He Changdi had been trying to find a chance to meet General Chen for days. He obviously hadn't expected that a small gourd of grape wine would do the trick that easily. When he managed to get over his shock, He Changdi quickly seized his moment and respectfully answered, replying to Great General, "This subordinate is the third son of House Jing'an, He Changdi. It has been more than a month since this subordinate joined the northern border troops, and this subordinate is currently serving as a lieutenant in the right wing." Great General Qian's eyes bulged as he stared at He Changdi in disbelief. Once upon a time, he had taught a few martial arts skills to Prince Jin and a certain brat called He Sanlang, this very same He Sanlang. However, wasn't that brat tall and handsome back then? How did he turn into a bearded ruffian like this? Not that many years had passed, had they? If he remembered correctly, He Sanlang shouldn't be older than 20 this year. Actually, it wasn't strange that General Qian thought this way. People of any era liked to admire beauty. There were even men in the capital who would stick flowers in their hair. Most men would keep their face clean of any facial hair, even when they were well into their 30s. The second master of House Ying, Chu Chizheng, was a model example of this. Any bearded man on the street was likely over the age of 50. There really weren't many young men like He Changdi with beards. He Changdi's full beard was covering more than half of his handsome face. No wonder General Qian hadn't been able to recognize him at all. "You brat! Why have you come over here?" General Qian's first reaction was amazement, but he quickly turned stern and dissatisfied. He Changdi was about to reply when General Qian's expression turned serious. He suppressed his anger and said, "Come with me right now." Captain Guo watched as He Changdi's tall and slender silhouette followed behind General Qian as he walked to the main tent of the camp. A long moment passed before the captain finally shifted his gaze away. The corners of Captain Guo's lips curled up. He sighed and said, "That brat's pretty lucky." Zhong Mai gently smiled as he stood beside Captain Guo. "If there's a chance in the future, we really have to meet our brother's wife." He Changdi had been able to get close to Captain Guo as well as meet Great General Qian thanks to two small things that his wife had sent over to him. Those two small things had helped him a lot. That newlywed wife of his was really his lucky star. Chapter 187, Lucky Star, 3. Captain Guo shot a glance at his old comrade and said, "If you really envy him, why don't you take another wife, am I? It's already been more than 10 years. Originally, Zhong Mai did have a wife. He had been born into a military family, and so when the imperial court had sent out a conscription order, he was forced to abandon his wife of 6 months and leave home, leaving behind both his old father and young wife. Before he left, his wife had just gotten pregnant. He had thought that his wife would give him a son or daughter to pamper. Who could have predicted that his village would get attacked by mountain bandits when his wife was 7 months pregnant? His father had sacrificed his life to protect his wife, but in the end, both of them had perished together with the unborn child in his wife's belly. Before Zhong Mai had left, he had a whole family. Not even a year later, he had no one. It was due to this that he hadn't retired from the army and stayed with the troops, even though he had been wounded. Zhong Mai shook his head and changed the topic. "It looks like that brat hid other good things, too. When I get back to my tent, I have to search harder. There might be something even tastier to eat." Captain Guo could only shake his head helplessly. When Chu Lian returned to the Jinggan estate, she went to Qingxi Hall first. Senior servant Liu came out to welcome her. She reported the news of the Wang family's punishment to Chu Lian before leading her into Qingxi Hall to meet Matriarch He. Matriarch He reassured her for a bit before reminding her that she needed to attend the Mid-Autumn Banquet, which was a feast held inside the palace. She had to show her gratitude for the bestowal of the noble title there, too. The matriarch reminded her to prepare for the banquet. The Mid-Autumn Banquet was meant for titled noble madams. It shouldn't have affected Chu Lian at all, and she could have had a nice celebration with the girls in her own courtyard otherwise. However, since she was now 5th-ranked honored Lady Genie, she was no longer able to skip the banquet. Chu Lian took leave of Matriarch He and returned to her own courtyard. Senior servants Gui and Zhong had the other servants show her the court dress she was to wear for the Mid-Autumn Banquet. Chu Lian didn't know a single thing about the etiquette and rules for this type of clothing, so she could only tell the senior servants to do as they saw fit. She practiced 2 more pages of calligraphy in her small study before looking over her plan to revitalize Guilin restaurant once again. She removed the parts that weren't very suitable and added a few more based on what she had seen today. After this bit of business, it was already time for rest. Over the course of the next 2 days, Chu Lian handed over the silver she had saved up and requested the matriarch to find some good workers for her. She needed help to renovate Guilin restaurant according to her plan. Time flew by too quickly, and in the blink of an eye, it was already the day of the Mid-Autumn Festival. The custom of the Great Wu dynasty was to eat round cakes today. These were a type of dessert made out of glutinous rice, soft and sticky. When the glutinous rice was cooked, it could be formed into a round shape and rolled in a finishing layer of powder. To get different flavors, they merely rolled the cakes in different powders. The most common flavors were sesame, soybean, and chestnut. They were kind of like mochi in the modern world. It was extremely easy to make them, and the only difference was in the outer layer of powder. When Chu Lian got up, the first thing she saw was senior servant Gui ordering the cooks to make round cakes. Chu Lian couldn't muster up any appetite at all when she looked at these sticky desserts. Instead, she thought back to the mooncakes eaten during the Mid-Autumn festivals of the modern world. In the end, she couldn't resist the urge and decided to make some. Even if she didn't give them away to others, she could eat them and reminisce about life back in a more modern era. Chapter 188, Venturing into the Palace, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Upon hearing that third young madam was thinking about a new type of confection, all the handmaids grew excited. They went about making the preparations with wide grins on their faces, clearing out the kitchen in order to make space as well as readying the ingredients for assembly and baking. It wasn't too hard to make mooncakes. As long as they had the right ingredients, it was much simpler than the 8 confections. Since there was a limit to the ingredients they could prepare on such short notice, Chu Lian's mooncake stuffing was limited to egg yolk, ham, bean paste, and pine nuts with jujube paste. She had Xian retrieve the previously prepared molds for the mooncakes. Next, she wrapped the stuffing inside the mooncake skin and carved an auspicious image on top of the soft skin. Finally, they put the mooncakes into the oven to finish them off. It was easy to shape the Cantonese-style mooncakes. After baking, the outer layer of skin was crisp and fluffy with delicate, lovely forms. Since it wasn't one of the Great Wu dynasty's traditional mid-autumn desserts, Chu Lian didn't make many mooncakes, for fear that they would outshine the round cakes. She didn't send any mooncakes to the other branches of the family either, and only prepared enough for herself to eat in her own courtyard, just to satisfy her cravings. Chu Lian made each mooncake about the size of a lychee, even with the stuffing inside. You could finish one piece in 2 or 3 bites, so it was very convenient. When she was done making mooncakes, Chu Lian changed into her court dress befitting a 5th-ranked honored lady. She let Jingyan dress her up with all the accessories that came in the set. When she was done, senior servant Liu had come over to invite her to the outer court. Before she left, Xian glanced at the mooncakes sitting on a tray on the table and asked, "Third young madam, do you want to bring some mooncakes to eat on the way there?" Senior servant Liu had just told Chu Lian that the entire banquet would probably last until night time, and they would likely return to the estate at a very late hour. She had to bring everything she needed, as the palace wasn't like any other normal estate. There were many rules and inconveniences. After keeping that in consideration, Chu Lian nodded. "Bring some. Pack some extra clothes just in case, too." Xian filled up a small exquisite box with a whole plate of mooncakes and took out a pale pinkish-purple colored purse embroidered with autumn lotuses. She then quickly stuffed 3 mooncakes within and shoved it into Chu Lian's hands. As Chu Lian watched Xian's actions, she almost burst out into laughter. "Why, are you afraid that your master will starve to death?" Xian's face flushed a little. Actually, the blame for Xian's strange habit of bringing Chu Lian snacks laid with Chu Lian herself. It was all thanks to Chu Lian always bringing some snacks along with her whenever she left the estate. It had also been Chu Lian who had ordered the maidservants to make these small purses in the first place. Chu Lian took the purse and even added a few pieces of jerky inside. Senior servant Gui held back the urge to sigh at this. Thinking she might need a reminder, senior servant Gui piped up, "Third young madam, it's getting late, it's about time to leave." By the time they reached the outer court, the steward had already finished preparing the carriages. Matriarch he was already seated in the parlor waiting with her handmaid Muxiang and senior servant Ju. Seated next to her was Madame Zhu. Madame Zhu hadn't changed into a court dress. The mid-autumn banquet started in the late afternoon, so she would have to wait until then to enter the palace. Matriarch he was accompanying Chu Lian into the palace this early in the afternoon for a few reasons. Firstly, she was afraid that Chu Lian would mess up somehow while giving thanks to the emperor on her first venture into the palace. Secondly, she wanted to take this chance to chat with her old friend, the Empress Dowager. She could also take her youngest granddaughter-in-law to meet the Empress Dowager on the way. When Madame Zhu noticed that Chu Lian had entered the parlor with her servants, she couldn't resist looking this third sister-in-law of hers up and down. Chu Lian was wearing an honored lady's court dress. Although it was just a fifth-ranked title, it was very different from the court dress of a normal noble madam. TL note: the return of food porn. The Great Wu Dynasty's traditional round cakes might look something like these modern round cakes or tuanggao. Unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with these, so I can't tell you how they taste. Round cakes. Chu Lian made Cantonese-style moon cakes. These are basically made with lotus or red bean paste and egg yolk, wrapped in a layer of dough and baked until golden brown. Traditional baked mooncakes. She also stuffed some mooncakes with ham, which I didn't know was a thing. OAO mooncakes with ham stuffing. I prefer modern snowskin mooncakes myself. They come in such pretty colors and tasty flavors. Snowskin mooncakes. Chapter 189, Venturing into the Palace, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. The court dresses for the noble madams, from the first rank to the last, were all dark in color. The styles were also passed down from the previous dynasty, very traditional and old. Even a young lady would seem old wearing them. However, the court dresses for female members of the imperial family, which included imperial princesses, royal princesses, feudal princesses, and honored ladies, were always made in the latest styles of the dynasty. The honored lady's court dress had a pale pinkish-purple base and embroidered golden flowers on the collars and sleeves. The main part of the dress was a bright red jacquard weave with peonies sewn on top with golden brocade. Such a fresh, tender color complemented Chu Lian's equally tender age well. A broad sash tied at the waist completed the outfit, making her waist look even more slender than before. One of the jade hair ornaments that the emperor had given her was set on the top of her head. The dignified hairstyle served as the figurative cherry on top. It emphasized her blossoming femininity and discarded the last bits of her childish girliness. Matriarch he had obviously been blown away by Chu Lian's get-up today. She nodded inwardly, appreciating the beauty of Sanlang's wife. Beauty is loved by all, and matriarch he wasn't an exception to the rule. She chuckled and waved towards Chu Lian. Sanlang's wife, come over to grandmother's side. Let grandmother take a good look at you. After Chu Lian bowed in greeting to matriarch he and Madame Zhu, she quickly moved over to matriarch his side. The matriarch looked her over in satisfaction before helping her adjust the jade hairpin on her head that had gone slightly askew. Although there was still a trace of a smile on Madame Zhu's face, her inner heart wasn't at all as peaceful as her expression suggested. She suppressed the anger within and said, "Third sister-in-law, since you're preparing to enter the palace to give thanks today, you should have gotten ready earlier. How could you let grandmother wait in the parlor like this?" Chu Lian was momentarily stunned. She hadn't expected Madame Zhu to make trouble for her right in front of the matriarch. Actually, she wasn't late at all. The matriarch had instructed her to meet at this time in the outer court so they could leave together. Matriarch he was older, so it was easier for her to get up in the morning. Thus, she had happened to arrive at the parlor just a moment earlier. The matriarch's outstretched hands that were helping to straighten Chu Lian's hair suddenly froze. Chu Lian sighed in her heart, helpless. If she had known that this would happen, she shouldn't have bothered to interfere when the main kitchen had caught fire. Since she was about to enter the palace, Chu Lian didn't want to cause a ruckus about it now. She turned around and bobbed in Madame Zhu's direction. Eldest sister-in-law is right. I'll take note of it next time. When Chu Lian had bowed down to her and apologized while dressed as a fifth-ranked honored lady, a perverted sense of satisfaction had suffused within Madame Zhu's heart. She immediately switched to a benevolent expression and personally lifted Chu Lian up from her curtsy. Third sister-in-law, it wasn't my intention to reprimand you, but grandmother is already at such an age, she can't withstand such trouble. Just take note of it in the future. If not, I won't let it go just like that the next time. Chu Lian's lowered face instantly turned cold. Matriarch he had been watching the entire scene with sharp eyes. She blinked and said, "All right, it's time to go. Sanlang's wife, let's leave." Madame Zhu watched Chu Lian help Matriarch he up the carriage before returning to her own courtyard. The lake blue handkerchief in her hands had already been wrung until it was coming apart at the seams. Chu Lian helped Matriarch he off the carriage in front of Zhuqiu Gate. Following that, they got onto the sedans that the Empress Dowager had sent to them, and they rode these until they reached the south gate of the inner palace. They were invited to disembark from the sedans and led inside by a eunuch. Red roof tiles, painted green walls, grand rafters, carved walls, and glass tiles scattered the afternoon sunbeams, creating a radiant scene that did well to show off the splendor of the Great Wu dynasty. Matriarch he was about to follow Chu Lian on her way to meet the emperor to give thanks, but was held back by a middle-aged eunuch. "Matriarch, please follow this one to the Empress Dowager's palace. The Empress Dowager has been waiting since morning." TL note: this looks like a good approximation of what Chu Lian is wearing. Please ignore any historical inaccuracies if the style of this dress doesn't match with the time period. Chapter 190, Venturing into the Palace, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. Matriarch he sighed. She had expected this to happen, so she had given Chu Lian all the instructions she could in the carriage. Now, she could only pat Chu Lian's small, fair hand in comfort and hope that Chu Lian's heart was big enough to face what was ahead. Since Matriarch he couldn't even meet the emperor, servants like Xian and senior servant Gui were held back in a side hall. Only Chu Lian was led by a young inner palace eunuch towards the great palace hall ahead. The golden tiles beneath her feet had been shined until they reflected her image like mirrors. Chu Lian didn't dare to walk too quickly, afraid that she would fall. Thus, this became a long and arduous walk for her. She was about to meet the leader of the entire Great Wu dynasty, the emperor of a whole country who held power over life and death here. She would be lying if she said she wasn't nervous. She hadn't been born in this dynasty, so although she respected the imperial family, she didn't really fear them. "Eunuch son, where are you taking honored Lady Genie?" Suddenly, a thin, clear voice called out from behind them. Chu Lian turned around at the same time as the eunuch guiding her, and was met with the sight of a tall and slender man standing at the top of some white stone stairs. The man's azure eyes were too outstanding. How could she possibly forget them so easily? Eunuch's son bowed towards Prince Jin. Replying to Prince Jin, "This servant is taking honored lady to meet the emperor." Prince Jin's light gaze landed upon Chu Lian. His clearly measuring gaze made Chu Lian feel uncomfortable. "At least you're dressed better today." Chu Lian froze for a bit, her almond-shaped eyes widening in surprise. What? Was Prince Jin criticizing her outfit? When had she become so familiar with Prince Jin? Chu Lian didn't want to get involved with any of the imperial family at all, especially the children of the emperor. They were the center of imperial power. She definitely didn't want to be stuck in between any imperial power struggles. Although she did help him out a bit the last time they met, Chu Lian intended to keep her distance from him, as much as she could. Chu Lian bobbed towards Prince Jin, as thanks for his compliment. If Prince Jin doesn't have any business with this one will continue guiding honored Lady Genie, Eunuch's son said respectfully. Chu Lian was about to turn and leave, when Prince Jin suddenly drew closer and shot Eunuch's son a look. Eunuch's son quickly lowered his head and retreated a few steps, waiting at the side. Prince Jin was about as tall as he Changdi, so when he stood in front of Chu Lian, it was as if there was a huge ominous cloud before her. Prince Jin looked down at her without any sort of expression of his face. Although his tone was calm, his words made Chu Lian stiffen up for a brief moment. Genie, since you helped this prince, you're likely a smart one inside. This prince advises you not to act beyond your means. Even if you have the desire to, you should think twice and measure the consequences in your heart first. Think thrice before you decide to do anything. Chu Lian's slender brows drew together. Prince Jin, I can't understand what you're saying. If you don't understand, then think more on it. Prince Jin's light yet murky eyes shot a warning look at Chu Lian. Although Chu Lian didn't show any of her emotions on the surface, she was already hitting her head against a wall on the inside. What was this? What kind of ruthless, preposterous thing had she done to make Prince Jin suspicious of her? Was he going crazy, too? Chu Lian felt that she hadn't done anything harmful since coming to the Great Wu dynasty. However, the fact of the matter was she had just been accused, and by someone like Prince Jin whom she had only met once before. Even the nicest person had a limit to their temper. Chu Lian didn't want to pretend to be polite to Prince Jin any longer. Her cheeks were puffed up as she glared at him. I'll think over Prince Jin's words carefully when I get home. There's no need for Prince Jin to trouble yourself over me. When she was done, she turned and ran, stunning Prince Jin for a moment. Eunuch Sun found the whole situation a little awkward. After bowing in farewell to Prince Jin, he chased after her, shouting, "Honored lady, please walk a little slower. That's the wrong way, the hall isn't that way." Chu Lian could only turn to run in the right direction. However, who could have expected the floor to be so slippery? She was moving too fast, and the court dress had way too many layers. She accidentally stepped on the hem of her dress and fell to the floor. Chapter 191, Meeting the Emperor, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volare novels. Please read from the original source. By the time Chu Lian had awkwardly gotten up from the floor with the help of Eunuch Sun, she glanced back and saw that Prince Jin was still standing at the top of the stairs. His azure eyes were definitely pointed in her direction. Strangely, Chu Lian got the feeling that there was a trace of humor in those unusual eyes of his, almost like he was laughing at her. After she finished straightening out her clothes, Chu Lian stomped her foot in frustration. She didn't dare to turn back around anymore, afraid that she would fall down again. This time, she obediently followed behind Eunuch Sun, carefully watching her steps. Prince Jin turned around, and at an angle that Chu Lian couldn't see, the corners of his lips hooked up into a slight smile. Now that he had seen more of Chu Lian's personality, he couldn't quite believe that she would arrange a secret meeting with Xiao Bojian. Perhaps his good friend He Sanlang had misunderstood her. Eunuch Sun brought Chu Lian inside the Imperial Gardens to Tingyu Pavilion. He announced, "Your Majesty, honored Lady Genie has arrived." After that report, he retreated to one side, revealing Chu Lian behind him. Chu Lian lowered her gaze and kneeled down to greet this Chengping Emperor. Chu Lian pays respects to Your Majesty. Suddenly, bell-like laughter rang out. "Your Majesty, this new honored Lady Genie that you've named is quite the well-mannered young lady." The Chengping Emperor above her laughed along with her. His voice was low and magnetic, imposing through sound alone. Chu Lian listened as the Chengping Emperor said, "All right, Imperial concubine, don't tease the girl." Chu Lian's head was still lowered, but a glint flashed through her eyes. "Imperial concubine? Imperial concubine Wei?" Her face contorted into an expression full of suffering. The more she didn't want it, the more likely it was to happen, wasn't it? She had gone against Imperial Princess Liao before. Now the moment she entered the palace, she was faced with Imperial Princess Liao's mother, Imperial concubine Wei. Were the heavens toying with her? "Rise, and let me take a look at you." The Chengping Emperor seemed to be in a good mood today, so his tone was rather carefree. Chu Lian stood and slowly looked up. She sneaked a glance at the two people seated above her. The Chengping Emperor was dressed in imperial yellow. Although he was already middle-aged, he hadn't lost his figure. His eyes were deep and unreadable. The beautiful woman next to him, dressed in an elaborate purple court dress, looked to be in her 20s. She had a tall and slender figure. Her dress was tied right below her bust, emphasizing the fullness of her bosom. She radiated an aura full of pride and strength. Her makeup only added to her charm. With lips painted bright and red, she was just as equally a temptation as she was untouchable by mortal men. This was the emperor's most favored concubine at the moment, imperial concubine Wei. The cat-like shape of her eyes made it seem as if she was peering down at Chu Lian from the corner of her eyes. Chu Lian had only taken a quick peek at these two great personages before looking down again. Since she had moved too quickly, she hadn't been able to get a clear view of their expressions. When the Chengping Emperor caught sight of Chu Lian's face, there was a minute shift in his originally calm expression. The deep pools of his eyes flashed for an instant, quickly masking over the change as if he had never been surprised in the first place. Imperial concubine Wei held onto the Chengping Emperor's toned arm, all smiles. She purposefully rubbed her bosom on his arm, smiling tenderly as she said, My, what a surprise. So fertility isn't the only virtue of a lady from House Ying. Look at how beautiful she is. The He family's Sanlang is a lucky one. After saying so, she let out a peal of laughter. Chu Lian frowned, but kept her head lowered. To a bystander, Imperial concubine Wei's words might seem like nothing but a harmless joke. However, Chu Lian could discern the mockery within her words. As a noble lady, who would want their fertility, a matter that was usually kept quiet, to be taken as their main selling point? If not for House Ying's declining status, not a single person in this entire capital would dare to mention such a topic in front of a Chu family lady. The Chengping Emperor kept his stare on the girl before him. Suddenly, his brows drew together. Genie, I've heard that you know how to make longevity peach buns that are a little different from the norm. They say your longevity peach buns look like real peaches. Since there's a festival today, why don't you make a plate to add to the festive spirit? Chu Lian hadn't expected such a request from the Chengping Emperor. However, after thinking about it for a bit, it wasn't all that strange. On the day she had visited the Dingyuan estate, that plate of longevity peach buns had given Madame Huang a huge slap on the face and earned the praise of the old Marquis Dingyuan. It had likely spread to all the social circles of the capital by now. Chu Lian agreed to the request without any hesitation. When Eunuch Sun heard this, he quickly stepped forward and asked Chu Lian what ingredients she would need. The Chengping Emperor was momentarily surprised. He hadn't thought that she would agree so quickly. The people of this era guarded their secret recipes with their lives. Getting a secret recipe was akin to getting a huge fortune. Making those longevity peach buns right here in Tingyu Pavilion, in front of a crowd, meant that all the servants here would be able to watch. The secret recipe would definitely be exposed. Did she not care about that one bit? The Chengping Emperor's impression of this magnanimous girl increased favorably. If Chu Lian were to find out that the Chengping Emperor had been using that request to test her personality, she would have definitely rolled her eyes. Even longevity peach buns could be deemed a secret recipe. She was lacking in everything right now, and of them all, the biggest was money. But the one thing Chu Lian did actually have was secret recipes. If the Chengping Emperor wanted 10 secret recipes, she could write them all out for him now without even blinking. TL note: Chengping Emperor is the emperor's full title, and not his personal name. Chapter 192, Meeting the Emperor, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Imperial concubine Wei's eyes turned cold. She shot a glance at her handmaid and lightly tapped her seat with a finger. When the handmaid saw that, she lowered her head and snuck out of the area. In a moment, Eunuch Sun had brought over all the ingredients that Chu Lian needed. He placed them on top of a wooden table that had been moved into the room just for this purpose. Next to it was a specially made stove, which the Imperial Palace's unique small steamers could be placed on. A handmaid stood behind Chu Lian, apparently tasked with assisting her. When the Chengping Emperor looked towards the center of the hall, his gaze landed upon the handmaid standing respectfully behind Chu Lian. Imperial concubine, for some reason, I find that handmaid behind Genie a little familiar to the eye. Imperial concubine Wei froze for a moment. She hadn't expected the Chengping Emperor to have such a good memory. That handmaid served in her palace. However, her expression didn't change one bit as she explained, that handmaid comes from this concubine's palace. She usually boils some soups for me and she has rather good culinary skills. This concubine was afraid that other maidservants wouldn't put forth their best efforts, so this concubine specially called her here to help Genie. The Chengping Emperor needed Imperial concubine Wei's slender hand. How thought of you, my beloved concubine. Genie, since Imperial concubine Wei has made such a kind consideration for you, make sure you live up to her expectations. Understood, Your Majesty. Chu Lian started preparing the ingredients before her with an unhurried and calm air. The handmaid also came forth to help her. Although Chu Lian was suspicious that Imperial concubine Wei was going to pull some tricks on her, they were right in front of the emperor. Imperial concubine Wei wouldn't be able to do much. Thus, Chu Lian took a little more care in preparing each ingredient before her. The corners of Imperial concubine Wei's lips curled up as she watched the busy Chu Lian bustling about below. Her eye blinked once quickly, and the handmaid helping Chu Lian happened to catch the wink. Imperial concubine Wei then put on a caring facade as she said, "What a surprise that Genie is so familiar with cooking. This concubine heard that you even know how to make quite a few types of confections. Why don't you stay in the imperial kitchens and teach some of your skills to the imperial cooks when you're done here? It can be counted as making a contribution to the imperial family." Without waiting for Chu Lian to reply, a woman's voice sounded from outside the hall. "Imperial concubine Wei, aren't your words a little inappropriate there? No matter what, Genie is a noble lady. She has also been given the title of Honored Lady by His Majesty. By having her stay back to teach the imperial cooks, isn't that an insult to the face of our imperial family?" Imperial concubine Wei's attention immediately locked onto the woman who walked in, dressed in imperial yellow. Her eyes were lit with a spark of anger. Imperial concubine Wei sneered as she said, "This sister greets Empress. It's the first time that Empress is meeting Genie, but Empress is already speaking up for her. Genie will have to properly thank my dear sister Empress later on." Empress Shen's lips twitched upwards in a smile. She first turned to the Chengping Emperor to make her greeting bow. Chu Lian had to stop whatever she was doing and give a proper greeting to the Empress. The smile on the Emperor's face disappeared. "Empress, why have you come here?" "Hearing that your Majesty summoned Genie, this humble one wanted to come over to have a look. See, hasn't this humble one arrived right in time? Otherwise, the most exciting part would be over. Since you've come, take a seat." Even though Imperial concubine Wei was completely unwilling, the Empress ranked higher than her. She had to give up the seat right next to the Emperor and sit below them instead. When the eyes of the two women met, there was an exchange of daggers in their gazes. The Chengping Emperor rubbed at his temples and waved at Chu Lian to continue what she was doing. However, he had already lost his earlier excitement. Imperial concubine Wei suddenly smiled at Empress Shun with a trace of provocation. Following that, she continued watching Chu Lian. Chu Lian calmed her heart down again. She wasn't too frightened by imperial power in the end. Even though there were three great personages watching her cook, she treated them as normal guests and didn't feel too pressured by them at all. She was serious about everything she did, especially when it came to food. An old woman who had taught her how to cook had once said, "Food tastes best when a serious person cooks it seriously." Thus, she completely immersed herself in the process of cooking with an extremely earnest expression. Someone working hard with all their concentration could always give a favorable impression. The annoyance that had risen in the Emperor's heart thanks to Empress Shun's appearance had been entirely cast away by Chu Lian's seriousness. He watched the hard-working Chu Lian in satisfaction, even admiring her dutifulness a little. When Chu Lian finished preparing the dough, the handmaid had already placed two beautiful, freshly washed peaches right next to Chu Lian for her use. Since she didn't have any peach juice concentrate prepared, Chu Lian could only try to squeeze out the fruit juice herself and mix it into the dough. That way, the freshly steamed longevity peach buns would have the refreshingly sweet flavor of fresh peaches. She picked up a small knife and started to peel off the skin of the peaches, intending to cut them into smaller pieces. When Imperial concubine Wei noticed Chu Lian's actions, an evil smile appeared on her lips. 8. In the next moment, a girl's shrill scream filled the entire Tingyu pavilion. Chapter 193, Trap, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian was still holding a fresh, juicy peach in her left hand and a peeling knife in her right. She pressed her lips together lightly and tilted her head to one side as she looked at the handmaid who had screamed. Her eyes were bright and crystal clear. The handmaid's voice was sharp and thin. In her extreme fright, she had not only cried out once, but even kept screaming after that. When she had tried to retreat, her panic had caused her to step onto the hem of her own dress, leaving her a pathetic heap on the floor. Instantly, Tingyu Pavilion was as silent as a cemetery. When the handmaid recovered her wits and looked around her, she immediately turned pale. In the next second, she scrambled up to kneel on the floor and continuously kowtowed to the three great personages before her, pleading for mercy. This servant deserves to die. This servant deserves to die for losing composure in front of your majesties. Please have mercy, your majesties. Chu Lian's gaze swept towards the pleading handmaid, whose body was practically stuck to the ground. A trace of coldness flashed across her almond-shaped eyes. Then, she placed both the peach and the knife back onto the table. The shrewish scream had sounded like a banshee's cry. Chu Lian cast her gaze downwards and stood to one side. If she hadn't reacted in time, and if she hadn't had experience and guts much stronger from the girls of this era, she would have been the one who screamed instead. The one trembling and begging for mercy on the floor in front of the emperor would be her. The Chengping emperor's previously uplifted mood took a plunge, thanks to that sharp, girlish scream. His expression was stern and dark. The pressure of a long-standing ruler made even Empress Shun and imperial concubine Wei feel like cowering. The Chengping emperor's gaze landed upon imperial concubine Wei. Concubine, is this how a handmaid from your palace behaves? Imperial concubine Wei's expression changed instantly. She caught the smug smile of Empress Shun from the corner of her eyes, and immediately felt the urge to kill this stupid servant. She had simply instructed her to make a little bit of trouble for honored Lady Jeannie. Well, Jeannie was still standing there perfectly fine. However, that stupid bitch had dragged herself into a hole, and she had even dragged her master with her. Imperial concubine Wei grit her teeth and pulled out a smile to face the Chengping emperor with. Your Majesty, please calm down. It was this concubine's failure to teach this servant that caused your Majesty to suffer such a fright. She deserves to be severely punished. After Imperial concubine Wei finished speaking, she waved her wide sleeves and summoned two tall eunuchs into the hall. The two eunuchs grabbed hold of the handmaid's arms and were about to stuff her mouth shut, intending to drag her out to be executed. This handmaid had served Imperial concubine Wei for quite a few years, so she knew the concubine's temper well. She knew that if she were dragged out right now, there was only one fate that awaited her, death. Thus, the handmaid struggled with all her might. Perhaps her strong will to live had brought out her latent power. The weak handmaid actually managed to push the two tall eunuchs aside. This handmaid still had some wits about her. She knew that it would be useless to plead with Imperial concubine Wei now. She stumbled forward a few steps and knelt before the emperor and empress, words pouring out for her mouth as she half-sobbed, "Please spare my life, your majesties. This servant didn't do it on purpose. It was all the honored lady. It was the honored lady. If it hadn't been for the honored lady, this servant wouldn't have lost composure in front of your majesties and let your majesties suffer such a fright." When the handmaid had broken out of the eunuch's hold, Imperial concubine Wei had continued shooting looks at the eunuchs. However, they were still too late. The handmaid had already spilled out what she wanted to say. Imperial concubine Wei was extremely frustrated. Her gaze was icy cold, and she looked upon that handmaid as if she was instead a convict on death row rather than a loyal servant. It was rare for Empress Shun to get such a great chance to knock Imperial concubine Wei down a few pegs in front of the emperor. How could she possibly let this opportunity go? She purposely raised a brow and asked, "Oh? So there's something else to this matter. Emperor, since there is some other reason behind her actions, we have to investigate this matter fully. Otherwise, there'll be injustice in our imperial palace." The Chengping emperor rubbed his temples and waved at Empress Shun, giving her the go-ahead. With one look from Empress Shun, the eunuchs who were about to grab hold of the handmaid again retreated. Imperial concubine Wei's hands turned into fists under her wide sleeves. She was so angry that she almost pierced her palms with her nails. She stared at the kneeling figure below her, eyes as cold as a tundra. Even though the handmaid had gotten a chance to explain herself from Empress Shun, she still didn't dare to drag Imperial concubine Wei down with her. Otherwise, if she somehow managed to walk out of Tingyu Pavilion alive today, she would definitely die in several hundred other ways. Empress Shun gazed down at the handmaid who had broken custom in front of the emperor, her stare heavy with the weight of her imperial might. You just said that it was all because of honored Lady Genie. Tell me exactly what happened, truthfully. Malice flashed through the handmaid's lowered eyes. With all the great personages gathered here in this Tingyu Pavilion, as a lowly handmaid, the only one she could attack was that measly honored lady. She took a few deep breaths and tried her best to calm her tone down. Replying to your majesty, this servant was just assisting honored Lady Genie, but a huge black worm suddenly landed on this servant's hand. This servant suffered a fright, so, this servant couldn't help but scream. Empress Shun's expression darkened. How could there possibly be worms before us? Are you lying to me? When Empress Shun finished speaking, her gaze shifted to Chu Lian's face, only to realize that House Jingan's third young madam was expressionless and calm. It was as if this whole fiasco had nothing to do with her, and she was only an onlooker. Chapter 194, Trap, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. The handmaid kowtowed a few more times, each one making a dull thud when her head hit the floor. How could this servant dare to lie in front of your majesties? That worm came from within the fresh peach. Your majesty, if it seems beyond belief, how about ordering someone to check the peach? Empress Shun shot a look at a middle-aged eunuch waiting on the side. In a moment, that middle-aged eunuch picked up the half of the peach that Chu Lian had placed on the table. As expected, he found a large hole where a worm had been near the center of the peach. The eunuch reported his finding, and after a few moments, he found that troublemaking, black, wriggling worm near the table. When the handmaid saw that evidence to her claims had been found, her tense heart relaxed for a moment. She almost collapsed on the ground after losing all the strength in her body. It was the honored lady who tossed that worm onto this servant's hand, causing this servant to lose composure before your majesties. Your majesty, please seek justice for this servant. Chu Lian cast a sideways glance towards the handmaid who had suddenly become the victim. The corners of her lips curved upwards. This silly girl, did she think anyone here was stupid? As expected, Empress Shun had thought further. So what you're trying to say is that honored Lady Genie purposely tried to lead you into a trap? You're just a lowly handmaid. What benefit is there for honored Lady Genie to harm you? The handmaid who had just found a moment to relax was suddenly plunged back into the depths of despair. Her eyes widened, and she couldn't speak for a long moment. This servant, doesn't know, Chu Lian was supposed to make longevity peach buns for the Chengping Emperor. The ingredients were all prepared by people in the palace. Furthermore, this handmaid was one of Imperial concubine Wei's servants. She had also been the one to wash those peaches before handing them over to Chu Lian. However, a disgusting worm had appeared in those supposedly fresh peaches, and Chu Lian was supposed to prepare the peaches herself. It was clear what had happened. Imperial concubine Wei had tried to quickly get rid of this handmaid earlier, because she didn't want the handmaid to make a mistake and expose everything. Even those with the slightest bit of brains could guess what was going on. However, Empress Shun had stopped her with the intention of trapping Imperial concubine Wei. Now that things had progressed to this step, it was as if Imperial concubine Wei had been slapped in the face by Empress Shun right in front of the emperor. Her face felt like it was on fire. Without waiting for Empress Shun to speak, the emperor ordered in a low tone. Take her out. Beat her to death. The emperor's words were much more powerful than Empress Shun's or Imperial concubine Wei's. Before the handmaid could speak another word, she was immediately taken away by two guards dressed in black and dragged out. Next, the Chengping Emperor glanced at Chu Lian and how she was standing obediently to one side with her head lowered, merely watching the show. If Chu Lian had raised her head at this moment, she would have been able to see the strange glint in the emperor's eyes. Concubine, you failed to teach your servants properly. When the Mid-Autumn Festival is over, you are grounded in your palace for half a month. The Chengping Emperor's tone sent chills down everyone's spine. Imperial concubine Wei looked up at the emperor in disbelief. However, the emperor looked like a cold and unreachable ruler right now, nothing at all like the emperor who had snuggled up with Imperial concubine Wei earlier on the same sofa. Imperial concubine Wei looked at the Chengping emperor with aggrieved eyes, hoping that he would retract his order. However, the emperor had already shifted his gaze away. Empress Shun looked gleeful. Right now, the only one in the palace who could vie with her for status was this imperial concubine Wei. This concubine had used so many little tricks in secret to fight with her. Who would have thought that a small matter like this would make imperial concubine Wei fall from grace? How could Empress Shun not be delighted? Following this line of thought, Empress Shun turned her head to look at Chu Lian, a minuscule hint of a smile on her face. As expected, a dog who would bite wouldn't bark. She had underestimated this honored Lady Genie. Imperial concubine Wei had no other choice but to accept her punishment. The emperor's gaze swept across the entire Tingyu pavilion before he ordered, "Forget it. I no longer have any interest in this. Genie, go to your grandmother over at the Empress Dowager's palace." Chu Lian respectfully bowed and answered in agreement. However, before the crowd started to leave Tingyu Pavilion, a bell-like voice called out from outside the entrance. "Father, father, Yaroa has come to greet you." When he heard that voice, the dark clouds in the emperor's expression dissipated a little. He turned to the entrance, and in a short moment, a little girl in a pink court dress came running in like a little butterfly. Following that, she threw herself into the emperor's welcoming embrace. The emperor bent down slightly, his face full of tender love as he patted Imperial Princess Leiao's hair gently. He asked her, "Leiao, why have you come all the way here?" Imperial Princess Leiao coquettishly answered, "Yaroa missed father, so Yaroa asked the eunuchs and came over. Yaroa hasn't seen father for 2 whole days. Did father miss Yaroa?" The emperor burst out into laughter, enjoying such a warm exchange with his daughter. "Father misses you too." Imperial Princess Leiao let out a bright smile. "Yaroa knows that father loves Yaroa the best." The emperor pinched his daughter's cheeks gently. Imperial concubine Wei had been kneeling at the side. When she saw her daughter entering the hall, her expression relaxed and she heaved a sigh of relief in her heart. Imperial Princess Leiao looked around Tingyu Pavilion and ran into Imperial concubine Wei's embrace next. "Mother, what's wrong? Why are you kneeling on the floor?" Imperial concubine Wei showed a slightly fatigued smile and combed through Imperial Princess Leiao's slightly messy fringe. "Yaroa, mother made a mistake. Mother has to kneel on the floor in repentance." Imperial Princess Leiao's eyes widened and she tried to pull her mother up from the ground. However, Imperial concubine Wei didn't move. Imperial Princess Leiao ran up to the emperor and hugged his arm, shaking it. "Father, mother didn't do it on purpose. Could you forgive mother just this once?" The Chengping emperor looked into Imperial Princess Leiao's eyes and finally gave in. "All right, get up. If there's a next time, you won't be able to make up for it even if Leiao pleads for you again." Delight bloomed on Imperial concubine Wei's face. She quickly said, "This humble one wouldn't dare. There won't be a next time." Empress Shun was about to grind her teeth down from frustration. She couldn't believe that the emperor had completely let go of his anger and pardoned Imperial concubine Wei's crime just because of 2 simple sentences from Imperial Princess Leiao. Chapter 195. Get It For Me. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Upon hearing that her mother was pardoned, Imperial Princess Leiao smiled even more sweetly as she clung onto the Chengping Emperor's arm and giggled. The Chengping Emperor looked at this young daughter of his who he had spoiled since the day she was born. In the blink of an eye, she had already turned 10 and was starting to bloom into a young lady's figure. Looking upon her now, he could only lament as his heart was filled with sadness. When Imperial Princess Leiao had been a little younger, he would even carry her in his arms. However, as she grew older, the most affectionate gesture he could give her was simply petting her soft head of hair. Imperial Princess Laiyao was the Chengping Emperor's youngest daughter. Daughters were meant to be spoiled, while sons were to be raised strictly. Furthermore, there were some other hidden matters that most people wouldn't know about, so the Chengping Emperor didn't mind pampering this youngest daughter of his a little more than usual. Imperial Princess Laiyao's almond-shaped eyes, a little similar to Chu Lian's own pair, flitted about Tingyu Pavilion once before finally settling on Chu Lian. Hidden by the Emperor's broad sleeves, Imperial Princess Laiyao's eyes narrowed before returning to their normal, lovable expression. Father, is she the new honored Lady Genie that you blessed with a title? The Chengping Emperor smiled. He wasn't a fool. He knew that his daughter was a little narrow-minded and liked to play some tricks on people she didn't like. For example, he knew that Imperial Princess Laiyao had definitely met Chu Lian at the Dingyuan estate, and he also knew that that particular encounter hadn't ended well for his daughter. Despite this fact, she was now acting as if today was the first time she was meeting Chu Lian. The Emperor was too lazy to expose her, so he played along. Yes, she is. Why are you asking, Laiyao? Chu Lian stood where she was and gave an appropriate greeting to Imperial Princess Laiyao from afar. Her heart sunk a little when she heard Imperial Princess Laiyao mentioning her on purpose. A grudge had been born between them during their first meeting, and it wasn't going to go away anytime soon. Imperial Princess Laiyao looked up at the tall and handsome emperor with wide eyes filled with admiration. Using a childish voice, she said, "Father, Yarrow heard that honored Lady Genie makes some tasty longevity peach buns. Why don't you let her make some for Yarrow in Yarrow's palace? Yarrow is really craving them." The moment Imperial Princess Laiyao finished speaking, the gentle expression on the emperor's face immediately turned into stormy clouds. Imperial concubine Wei's heart leaped in fright and she tugged Princess Laiyao towards her, scolding her in a quiet voice. "Yarrow, the palace has everything you could ever want to eat. Those longevity peach buns are only meant to be eaten during longevity feasts. You're not allowed to eat them otherwise." Imperial Princess Laiyao had only heard that the emperor was meeting Chu Lian in Tingyu Pavilion. She hadn't paid attention to anything else before rushing straight over, intending to cause some trouble for Chu Lian. Thus, she didn't know anything about what had just occurred here. Those longevity peach buns had been the cause of the emperor's earlier ire. Now that he was reminded of the matter, how could the emperor be in a good mood? Princess Laiyao had only wanted to cause trouble for Chu Lian somehow. How could she bother to listen to Imperial concubine Wei's reprimand? She pushed her way out of Imperial concubine Wei's arms and hugged the emperor's arm again. "Father, didn't you say you love Yarrow? Why won't you agree to such a small request for Yarrow? Yarrow just wants to eat honored Lady Genie's longevity peach buns." Chu Lian fought hard to keep the calm in her expression. This Imperial Princess Laiyao had really been spoiled beyond hope. The emperor's mood was clearly sinking lower and lower, but the princess still wasn't giving up. Empress Shun looked at Imperial concubine Wei and her daughter with cold eyes. Her gloom from earlier had completely disappeared. Instead, she now looked down upon Imperial Princess Laiyao full of disdain. What a narrow-minded girl. Imperial Princess Laiyao was already used to being spoiled. What she wanted was what she would get. Inside the palace, she was pampered by the emperor and spoiled by the imperial concubine. Even Consort De would give in to her demands. There wasn't a single time when she hadn't gotten her way. When she saw that the emperor remained silent, tears of frustration rolled down her cheeks in an effort to seek his attention. "Father doesn't love Yarrow anymore," sob. The Chengping emperor's mood had been dismal from the very beginning. It had only been alleviated slightly with the entrance of his daughter. But now, that very same daughter was crying, and her incessant cries were like needles piercing his brain. He was the great and mighty sovereign of this country. Even if he was inclined to spoil his children, there needed to be a limit in accordance with his stature. He looked down at his daughter, who seemed to have grown much taller since the last time he had seen her. She was already 10 years old. He had thought that that was still too young, so he had given in to her time and time again. However, now that her personality had been warped to this degree, he could no longer give in to everything she wanted. The Chengping emperor abruptly tossed his sleeves, shaking away the little hands that were clutching onto it. In a low voice, he rebuffed her and said, "Laiyao, are you finished with this nonsense? He had never ever reprimanded the princess before, but now he was scolding her in such a cold tone of voice. Liao was shocked by the first scolding she had ever received from the emperor. She stared up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, as if she couldn't believe that those words had come out of his mouth. After what seemed like an eternity, she asked with a trembling voice, "Father, you're scolding Yaroa?" Just as Imperial Princess Liao was about to say something else, Imperial concubine Wei covered her mouth in fright. Chapter 196. Get it for me, too. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. The Chengping Emperor tossed his sleeves again with a dark expression. Liao, I've been far too lenient with you in the past. I allowed you to do whatever you wanted without any limits. Even though Jeannie's rank is low, she is still an honored lady whose name I personally bestowed. How could I have her become a cook for you in your palace? Concubine, if you don't rein Liao in and teach her some proper manners, I'll send her to the Empress to be raised under her name. Empress Shun and Imperial concubine Wei hadn't expected such a proposal to come from the Emperor. Give her to the Empress to raise? How could that be possible? Imperial Princess Liao was already 10 this year. She wasn't a young, unknowing child. How could the Empress possibly raise her to love her as a mother at this age? Empress Shun and Imperial concubine Wei were both extremely resistant to this action. Imperial concubine Wei had been injured during childbirth, so Imperial Princess Liao was the only child she would ever have. How could Imperial concubine Wei possibly be willing to give up her only child to someone else? In her fright, Imperial concubine Wei's hold over Liao's mouth loosened. Imperial Princess Liao immediately cried out and made a fuss after getting free. Father, Yaroa doesn't want to go with the Empress. Yaroa doesn't want to leave Mother. Nonsense. Who gave you the right to address the Empress with such disrespect? Remember, the Empress is your legitimate mother. The Chengping Emperor rubbed his temples in fatigue. Forget it. I was the one who pampered you to this state. When the mid-autumn banquet ends, concubine Wei and Liao will be grounded for a month. I'll send senior servant Shi to teach Liao some etiquette and manners by then. After tossing out these orders, the Chengping Emperor left with his entourage, leaving only the sight of his broad back for the rest of the crowd to watch. Imperial Princess Liao couldn't believe that she had failed to teach a lesson to Chu Lian, and had even gotten both herself and her mother grounded. She turned her grudge-filled glare onto Chu Lian. Fortunately, after having suffered such a scolding from the Emperor, she had grown some brains and didn't go up to fight with Chu Lian directly. Chu Lian simply cast a sideways glance towards the Empress and concubine before Eunuch Sun came over to her side and quietly said, "Honored lady, please follow this servant. The Emperor has given orders for you to be escorted to the Empress Dowager's palace." Chu Lian nodded and said her thanks before bobbing in goodbye to the Empress. She then followed after Eunuch Sun and exited Tingyu Pavilion. Now, there was only Empress Shun, Imperial concubine Wei, and the shell-shocked Imperial Princess Liao left in the parlor of Tingyu Pavilion. Empress Shun smoothed out some invisible creases on her imperial yellow dress before walking with perfect steps to stand in front of the half-sprawled Imperial concubine Wei. She looked at her from the corner of her eyes and said, "Little sister Wei, you should consider that lesson you just learned carefully. As much as the Emperor loves you now, that favor is just as easily lost as it was gained." With these ambiguous words as her parting message, Empress Shun led her group of servants out of the hall. Imperial concubine Wei hugged Imperial Princess Liao to her, biting her bright red lips until she could taste a hint of blood in her mouth. It was only then that she carefully rearranged her expression and turned to look at her daughter. "Yaroa, remember everything that happened today. The day will come when we'll get our revenge for all that we've suffered." It wasn't until she had left Tingyu Pavilion far behind that Chu Lian could finally ease out of her state of tension. When she recalled Imperial Princess Liao's expression before she had left, Chu Lian just knew that the princess wasn't going to let her off that easily. She sighed. Was it just her fate to be a trouble magnet? TL note, Liao calling the Empress by her title, which serves as her name, since no one is allowed to address the Empress with her actual name except the Emperor, is disrespectful according to their customs. The Empress is considered to be the legitimate mother of all the Emperor's children, even if she didn't give birth to them herself. Thus, Liao is supposed to call her mother Empress or Muhu, while she can only call her own concubine mother by mother concubine or Mufei. I shortened this to mother as it's a bit of a mouthful. To draw a comparison to Western norms, it would be like a child calling their mother by their full name instead of saying mum. Chapter 197, Get It For Me, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. The imperial gardens were huge, and it was in the middle of autumn now. Large fields of chrysanthemum flowers were in bloom, coming in all different varieties and colors. From time to time, a few maidservants would pass through, painting quite the lively, bustling scene. The Empress Dowager's Ninghe Palace was quite far from Tingyu Pavilion. Eunuch Sun had mentioned this to her as he led the way. However, as they walked down a secluded path through the gardens, Chu Lian didn't feel like it was a long way off at all. There was much to see, and she freely admired the beautiful view of blooming, multicolored chrysanthemums around her. Eunuch Sun pointed out a pavilion not too far from them. Honored lady may rest in that pavilion for a moment. Chu Lian nodded and let Eunuch Sun lead them there. This pavilion was also surrounded by chrysanthemum flowers, and the scenery was beautiful. It was indeed a good place to take a short break. Eunuch Sun stood off to one side and smiled. Would honored lady like some tea and refreshments? This servant will fetch some, so honored lady may stay in this pavilion and rest for a moment. Chu Lian saw that Eunuch Sun was a nice person, so she smiled and shook her head. There's no need, Gong Gong. I'm only sitting here for a short while. Grandmother's still waiting for me, so it won't be good to tarry too long. Since Chu Lian had already made her refusal clear, Eunuch Sun didn't leave to fetch any refreshments. Chu Lian was actually being careful. The palace wasn't at all like the Jing'an estate. Anyone she bumped into here could be someone with great authority and power. It was better to keep a low profile. She had almost fallen into someone's trap just now, so she wasn't about to risk something else happening. At least her own maidservants were much more considerate. After that trip to Tingyu Pavilion, she was both physically and mentally tired. While looking over the beautiful flowers, she was indeed a little peckish. Eunuch Sun had his head lowered as he waited at the side. From the corner of his line of sight, he kept an eye on honored Lady Jeannie. Her unperturbed expression hadn't budged one bit while facing those great personages in Tingyu Pavilion, but now she had a wide grin on her face as she happily took out a small purse from within her wide sleeves and deftly opened it with her slender fingers. The contents of the purse were a little odd. Honored Lady Jeannie quickly took out a golden brown pastry embossed with a fancy pattern of the likes he had never seen before. This pastry was small enough to hold between her two fingers, and she kept a delicate grip on it as her cherry-red lips enclosed around one of the edges. He watched as she took her first bite, and her reaction was near instantaneous. Her wide, watery, almond-shaped eyes closed in enjoyment, forming two mini crescents as she savored her snack. In the next second, the round, fancy pastry had already disappeared into her stomach. Eunuch Sun unconsciously gulped a mouthful of saliva. In his heart, he was trying to match that pastry with the confections he had seen in the palace. However, even after going down the long list of confections that the palace served, he still couldn't recall if he had seen anything like what honored Lady Jeannie had just taken out to eat. The pastry in her hands looked really, really tasty. There was some sort of stuffing inside the crisp pastry skin, too. It looked like egg yolk. Could egg yolks be used to make confections? Then was it sweet or salty? Eunuch Sun knew he couldn't continue this line of thought. Otherwise, he would surely be unable to resist the urge, and would snatch that little purse of snacks right out of honored Lady Jeannie's hands. Eunuch Sun's head lowered even further. He didn't want to continue watching Chu Lian's blissful expression as she ate those snacks. Sob, sob, sob. No wonder the honored lady hadn't wanted him to fetch refreshments and tea. She had brought her own. Blinded by the delicious food, Eunuch Sun forgot that it wasn't normal for noble ladies to bring their own snacks when entering the palace. This wasn't a trip to the wilderness, after all. It was clear that honored Lady Jeannie was a strange exception to the rule. Chu Lian took out a thin strip of air-dried beef jerky and stuffed it into her mouth. This was a new flavor of beef jerky she had made. It was spicy and helped increase her appetite. She wondered if that fellow He Changdi could eat spicy food. Not too far away, the Chengping Emperor stood at the corner of a corridor. Next to him was his personal senior eunuch, Eunuch Wei. From this angle, the Chengping Emperor could see Chu Lian enjoying some sort of snack sitting in the pavilion a distance away. Sunlight happened to be streaming down upon her, lighting up her tiny face and completely exposing her extremely blissful expression to the Emperor's gaze. The Emperor couldn't help but wonder, what is that girl eating? Is it really that tasty? Thus, in the next moment, Eunuch Wei heard the Emperor order, "Go and retrieve that girl's purse for me." Eunuch Wei's eye twitched. For a second, he thought he was hallucinating, and it was purely his imagination that the great and wise Emperor had said such an odd thing. Had the Emperor, their high and mighty ruler, really just ordered him to snatch some snacks from an honored lady? TL note: imagine a cool stone pavilion surrounded by blooming chrysanthemums tilde bright colors, cool breeze, and the smell of the flowers tilde multicolored chrysanthemums pavilion in a garden. Chapter 199, A Purse of Snacks, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. When the Emperor saw that Eunuch Wei hadn't moved, he shot an icy glare at him. Eunuch Wei didn't dare to disobey orders, so he obediently went on his way, despite his troubled expression. Chu Lian was in the middle of eating her second mini mooncake when she heard Eunuch's son greeting someone. Curious, Chu Lian turned around, only to see that there was now another middle-aged eunuch standing behind her, holding a horsetail whisk in his arms. Eunuch's son smiled as he introduced the newly arrived eunuch to Chu Lian. "Honored lady, this is the chief steward of the imperial palace, Eunuch Wei. He serves by the emperor's side." Chu Lian smiled and nodded, greeting him cheerfully with the chief steward Wei. Chief steward Wei bowed towards Chu Lian respectfully. His eyes swept over the purse she was holding in her hands, and upon seeing its quickly depleting state, he couldn't help but inwardly beg, "My dear ancestor, please eat a little slower, the emperor's still waiting for those snack." Honored lady really knows how to enjoy life. This Mishyang Pavilion is the best place to admire flowers in the entire imperial gardens. Just a few days ago, the Empress Dowager even mentioned that the best thing to do during the middle of autumn is admire the chrysanthemums while enjoying some round cakes. Chu Lian found this whole meeting rather strange. This eunuch Wei should be a very busy person, judging from his job title. How could he have the spare time to stand here and make small talk with her? When she saw that eunuch Wei seemed to want to continue chatting, Chu Lian could only play along. "Chief Steward Wei, you're overestimating me. I just happened to be passing by and stopped to eat a few snacks since I was feeling hungry." Chu Lian looked down at the snack purse she was holding and continued, "These aren't round cakes, by the way. They're just some snacks I made for myself." "Oh." This servant has long heard that honored lady's heart is as good and pure as an orchid. This servant didn't think that honored lady would also know how to make her own confections. This servant wonders if there might be a chance to taste honored lady's cooking. When those words left Eunuch Wei's mouth, even he couldn't hold back the slight, embarrassed flush on his cheeks. But no matter how awkward this was, he couldn't disobey the emperor's orders. Chu Lian was stunned. What? A high-ranked eunuch she had never met before, the chief steward of the palace, at that was asking her for her snacks? With Chu Lian's baffled gaze focused on him, Eunuch Wei awkwardly received the snack purse. Following that, he gave her a deep, low bow, and then, he ran off, at light speed. Only Chu Lian was left standing in the pavilion, her hand still outstretched as she said to thin air, "Eunuch Wei. My purse." Unfortunately, Eunuch Wei was already long gone by now. Chu Lian's expression was cloudy. She turned to ask the frozen eunuch's son, "Eunuch son, is the food in the palace that bad? Otherwise, why would the chief steward have stolen her snacks and run away?" The corners of Eunuch son's lips twitched. In the end, he could only let honored Lady Jeannie continue believing her own conclusions. After all, he worked under Eunuch Wei. How could he dare to cast suspicion on Eunuch Wei's conduct? Though, within the privacy of his mind, he was also severely perplexed by this series of events. Eunuch Wei was one of the emperor's trusted servants, He could eat the best bird's nest and the best abalone every day if he wanted to. How could he have come to covet a young girl's snacks, and then just steal them away like that? Had the sun risen from the west today? But Eunuch Wei was already long gone, and it was just one small purse with a couple snacks in it. There was nothing special about it, so Chu Lian didn't pursue the matter further. She was about to rest for a moment longer before going over to the Empress Dowager's palace to look for Matriarch He, but Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly came striding over from not too far away. When Royal Princess Duanjia reached Chu Lian's side, she pulled her up without waiting for Chu Lian to give her a bow in greeting. I heard from the Empress Dowager that you were over here in the Imperial Gardens when I entered the palace, so I came over to find you. I didn't think I would bump into you at Mixiang Pavilion. Chapter 199, A Purse of Snacks, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian hadn't seen Royal Princess Duanjia for quite a few days, so it was a pleasant surprise to run into her here. She was about to speak when she noticed Royal Princess Duanjia looking her up and down with a measuring gaze. Finally, the princess's gaze landed on the remains of the half-eaten mooncake in her left hand. The princess blinked and asked, "Chu Liu, what are you eating?" The moment she heard that, Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She held up the remaining mooncake in her hand and replied honestly, "This is a type of snack I made earlier, it's called mooncake." Mooncake. It sounds really tasty. Chu Liu, how could you bring snacks into the palace? Why didn't you bring some for me, too? Royal Princess Duanjia's cheeks puffed up as she questioned her friend. Chu Lian replied very intelligently with an ah. She really didn't know how to deal with Royal Princess Duanjia. Suddenly, Royal Princess Duanjia held out an open palm in front of her face. Chu Lian stared at Princess Duanjia's face in befuddlement before looking at her open palm. "Princess, what are you blanking out for? Hand over all your food." Chu Lian. "Princess, you were a little too late. I just finished everything. There's only this half left." Chu Lian pressed a hand against her forehead. Why were the people around her such gluttons for food? It was just a simple snack, so why were there waves of people trying to snatch it away from her? Did they really have to be this way? Royal Princess Duanjia thought for a moment before harumphing in her uniquely Tsunda manner. "Well, if you've only got that half left, then so be it. I just want a small taste first. You'll make more for me later anyway, right?" Chu Lian stared at her. This half was only a half because she'd eaten the rest already. Her saliva was already on it. In the end, Chu Lian didn't have any other choice but to hand it over. "If Royal Princess Duanjia would like more, there's still one more box of it that my maidservants are carrying." Royal Princess Duanjia tossed the piece of mooncake into her mouth without any hesitation. She chewed it for a bit before her eyes lit up. "Chu Liu, this mooncake is a lot tastier than those round cakes." Eunuch Sun's eyes were twitching when he saw the normally calm, cool, and collected Royal Princess Duanjia was acting like a naive, haughty child. The two girls sat in Mixiang Pavilion for a while longer. However, because Chu Lian was afraid that more strange people would pop out of the bushes, she dragged Royal Princess Duanjia off to the Empress Dowager's Ninghe Palace before long. At a corner hidden out of sight from Mixiang Pavilion, Eunuch Wei stood before the Emperor. He offered the purse he took from Chu Lian to the Emperor with both hands, and the Emperor, in turn, received it. The purse itself was light in color, and there was some oil paper sewn inside of it. On the outside, the embroidery was fairly elaborate, but it wasn't anything special. It looked just like a simple snack purse that any noble would prepare for their children. The Emperor opened the little purse and looked inside, only to see the last remaining pastry within. It was about half the size of an egg and circular in shape, and its maker had imprinted the word fortune on top of it. Overall, it looked delightful and well made. The Emperor took it out and had a taste. His deep eyes squinted. The stuffing inside was actually quite salty. When he took a closer look, he discovered that the stuffing was made of salty egg yolk. It seemed that that girl did possess some talent in the culinary arts after all. Eunuch Wei stood behind the Chengping Emperor, sweating a little. If honored Lady Jeannie hadn't already been married off to House Jing'an's third son, he would have thought that their emperor's heart had been moved by the honored lady. This pastry is quite good. Since Jeannie was able to make it, then it's not strange that she could have made better longevity peach buns than Mr. Wang. It is exactly as the emperor says. Honored Lady Jeannie seems a little different from most noble ladies. The Chengping emperor finished the mooncake in just 2 or 3 bites. He seemed to have recalled something, as he burst into laughter and said, "She is indeed a little different from most. She's much braver than the average noble lady as well." The corners of Eunuch Wei's mouth twitched. Wasn't that just so? If it had been any other lady who had found a disgusting, black, wriggling worm inside of a fresh peach, they would have surely screamed in fright. However, honored Lady Jeannie had the guts to pick out that disgusting worm and instead used it to scare the person who had tried to prank her instead. However, when he thought back to how imperial concubine Wei and her handmaid had tried to trick Jeannie into losing composure before the emperor, Eunuch Wei thought that honored Lady Jeannie's actions had really made for quite the satisfying end. Chapter 200, A Purse of Snacks, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Meanwhile, Chu Lian finally arrived at the Empress Dowager's Ninghe Palace, together with Royal Princess Duanjia. At this time, Ninghe Palace was in a flurry. Most of the female imperial relatives had already arrived. Since she had been delayed for quite some time in the imperial gardens, Chu Lian didn't have the chance to meet the Empress Dowager personally. Instead, it was Princess Wei who pulled her to one side and helped her, giving her instructions on the necessary etiquette for today's event. Chu Lian had come into the palace today dressed as an honored lady, so her maidservants had not given her a married noble madam's hairstyle as usual. When Princess Wei had seen her daughter Duanjia standing together with Chu Lian, their similar figures made them look like a pretty pair of sisters from behind. Princess Wei smiled and patted Chu Lian's fair, tender hand. Matriarch He and old Duchess Zheng have gone to accompany the Empress Dowager. In a few moments, just follow behind me with Duanjia. After the meal, all the titled noble madams will be allowed to enter the palace for the banquet. It was clear that Princess Wei was being kind to Chu Lian. Of course, Chu Lian had sensed it for herself. She immediately gave a genuine smile and agreed. After having her afternoon meal with the various female members of the imperial family, Chu Lian and Duanjia sat in the corner of a side hall and sipped some honey water to help with digestion. They also watched as some palace servants led a few noble madams in to pay their respects to the Empress Dowager. This was the first time Chu Lian had seen such a grand event, so she couldn't resist observing everything. "Royal Princess, why are all the madams carrying a container of food?" Chu Lian asked curiously. Royal Princess Duanjia set down the teacup in her hands and cast a strange look at her. She was clearly surprised as she exclaimed, "You don't know?" Chu Lian shook her head, puzzled. She really didn't know anything about that at all. In the original novel, or at least the part she had read, Chu Lian had never attended any event as grand as this in the palace. Royal Princess Duanjia rolled her eyes at Chu Lian, speechless with her. "Your mind must be completely used up for thinking about food. How could you not know about something this simple? Those madams are carrying round cakes in those boxes." After Royal Princess Duanjia's explanation, it was only then that Chu Lian found out that there was traditionally a round cake competition held inside the palace during the mid-autumn banquet, ever since the time of the emperor's great-grandfather. Every noble madam who came to pay their respects to the Empress Dowager or the Empress would bring some round cakes prepared in their own estates, representing their house. The palace servants would place each set of round cakes on an offering table. When the banquet ended, everyone would choose the most delicious round cake, and there would be a prize for the winning house. This was also the current Empress Dowager's favorite part of the Mid-Autumn Festival. Chu Lian found it a little funny. She hadn't expected that there would be such an interesting event during the palace's Mid-Autumn banquet. "Which house won the competition last year?" Chu Lian asked. Royal Princess Duanjia sipped some tea before throwing a sideways glance at her. "The Pan estate." "The Pan estate? Pan Galau's estate?" A trace of suspicion showed up on Chu Lian's face. Royal Princess Duanjia had been watching her expression. She chuckled once and said, "Chu Liu, you're pretty sharp. Let me tell you, it wasn't just last year, 2 years ago, or even the year before that. The Pan estate has always been the champion of the mid-autumn banquet. Chu Lian's eyes widened a little. The inklings of something were coming together in her mind. Royal Princess Duanjia didn't try to disrupt her thoughts. She continued on to explain, last year, Madame Pan presented a plate of hazelnut-flavored round cakes. The princess then reached out to point at a distance away. There, see that person dressed in a purple overcoat? That's Madame Pan. Following the direction that Royal Princess Duanjia was pointing in, Chu Lian saw a round-faced middle-aged madam with slender brows. Her face was fair and her lips a little thick. When she smiled, she revealed 8 pearly white teeth, and when she was speaking with others, she always carried a slight smile on her lips, giving everyone a good impression of her. Chu Lian couldn't help but remember the day she had gone to Guilin restaurant and chanced upon the sight of her father in front of the Pan estate's entrance. Just as Chu Lian was about to sink into her thoughts, she suddenly heard a voice filled with mockery call out in their direction. Chapter 201, Offering Round Cakes, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Dear cousin, you've become rather capable, haven't you? You're actually keeping company with someone like that. Chu Lian was pulled back to reality by that young and angry voice. When she focused her gaze on the source, she saw Imperial Princess Layao standing not too far from them. The 2 ladies standing behind her were the same ones she had seen at the Dingyuan estate the last time, House Dingyuan's 5th Miss, Zhu Yuanqin, and feudal Princess Anmin. One of Chu Lian's eyebrows raised up and she was about to speak, but Royal Princess Duanjia had already started retorting, Layao, when has it been up to you to manage my business? If you're that free, why don't you mind your own? On the way to Ninghe Palace, Chu Lian had already told Royal Princess Duanjia about everything that had happened at Tingyu Pavilion. Duanjia knew about Princess Layao's grounding. Imperial Princess Layao was actually a rank higher than Royal Princess Duanjia. However, Prince Wei and the Chengping Emperor were blood brothers, and the Emperor favored Prince Wei. Since Royal Princess Duanjia was Prince Wei's only daughter, she held favor with both the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. She wasn't any less favored than Imperial Princess Layao. Imperial Princess Layao had always maintained a cordial relationship with her cousin, the equally pampered Royal Princess Duanjia. However, who could have expected Royal Princess Duanjia to side with Chu Lian? Layao's face had turned white from rage in an instant. She couldn't win over Royal Princess Duanjia, but was she really going to lose to a measly honored lady like Chu Lian? What was strange was that Imperial Princess Layao didn't say anything in retaliation to Royal Princess Duanjia's retort. Conversely, she actually held back her anger and only led her entourage away. At the same time, she glared fiercely at Chu Lian and showed an evil smirk. Chu Lian's brows drew together. That smirk gave her an uncomfortable feeling. Royal Princess Duanjia saw that Chu Lian didn't seem too happy, so she tried to reassure her in her own clumsy way. Chu Liu, you don't have to care about that sort of person. She's just throwing a tantrum because she's used to being spoiled. Who knows when she'll be able to grow some brains? Chu Lian managed to pull out a smile for the princess, but her right eyelid kept twitching for some reason. After about 10 minutes, Matriarch his handmaid, Mu Xiang, came rushing over from somewhere. Her face was extremely troubled. When she saw Chu Lian, it was as if she had seen salvation. Chu Lian looked over, but before she could ask what had happened, Mu Xiang had already spoken first. Third young madam, something bad happened. The matriarch requests for you to go to her. Chu Lian's brows were raised high. She kept feeling that this had something to do with Imperial Princess Layao. Seeing that Chu Lian was going to leave in a hurry, Royal Princess Duanjia frowned and questioned her. Chu Liu, what's wrong? Chu Lian suppressed the anxiety in her heart. Royal Princess, my grandmother is looking for me. I have to go first. Do you want me to come along with you? Chu Lian shook her head. Royal Princess Duanjia didn't press the matter. After watching Chu Lian leave with that handmaid, she moved to another wing of the side hall. Princess Wei seemed to have noticed the commotion. She sent someone to look for Royal Princess Duanjia, who then personally went to meet Princess Wei. It seems like something has happened to House Jingen. Chu Liu was called over by Matriarch He. Princess Wei gripped one of her handkerchiefs and thought for a moment, before instructing one of her senior servants. Send someone to take a look. If there's really something that can't be resolved, report back to me. Chu Lian was taken to another wing of the side hall by Mu Xiang. She went further in as Mu Xiang turned back to shut the doors tight. As expected, she saw Matriarch He sitting by the table in the room with Madame Zhu standing next to her respectfully. Mu Xiang led Chu Lian over to Matriarch He, only to see Matriarch He slam her cane on the ground and shout with anger, "Darlang's wife. What is going on here? How could you have lost our round cakes?" Madame Zhu lowered her head, face pale as she replied the matriarch with a trembling voice. "Grandmother, when granddaughter-in-law left the estate, granddaughter-in-law checked through everything personally. When granddaughter-in-law entered the palace, those round cakes were still there. They only disappeared once granddaughter-in-law entered Ninghe Palace. Granddaughter-in-law really doesn't know where they went." Matriarch He banged her cane on the floor again, controlling the urge to hit Madame Zhu with the cane. "Darlang's wife, tell me, when you entered the palace, who was holding onto that box of round cakes?" Although the palace was hosting a mid-autumn banquet today, the noble madams of each estate were not allowed to bring just anyone with them. Someone of Madame Zhu's rank was only allowed to bring in 2 servants at most. She had brought her most trusted senior servant and handmaid, senior servant Qiao and Jinshui. This whole matter was extremely suspicious, so Madame Zhu didn't dare to hide anything. However, she also wanted to protect her own servants. After mumbling for a bit, she didn't say anything concrete. Chu Lian was starting to frown while watching from the side. "Madame Zhu, look at what has happened. Are you not going to answer me? Are you trying to bring down our entire family?" Matriarch He was usually amiable and she rarely lost her temper like this. Years of accumulated stress poured out at once, even scaring Chu Lian, let alone the guilty Madame Zhu. "Grandmother, please calm down. Granddaughter-in-law will say it. It was granddaughter-in-law's Jinshui." Once Madame Zhu finished speaking, senior servant Zhu who served Matriarch He immediately shouted, "What a daring servant. Even after committing a crime, you're still refusing to admit to it. Kneel down at once." Jinshui was already afraid since she had lost the estate's round cakes. Now that she was being shouted at by senior servant Zhu, her legs turned to jelly and she collapsed on the ground. She tried and failed to support herself with her trembling arms a few times before she finally managed to crawl over to Matriarch He. Matriarch, please have mercy on this servant. This servant didn't lose the box on purpose. This servant was holding on to the box carefully and following eldest young madam into Ninghe Palace. When this servant was turning a corner, a eunuch suddenly pushed this servant. This servant smelled something strange and immediately fainted. When this servant came to, the box was gone. That eunuch had also disappeared. Matriarch, this servant has been caught in someone else's schemes. Chapter 202, Offering Round Cakes, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. In these circumstances, this Jinshui probably wasn't lying. She was Madame Zhu's trusted handmaid. Madame Zhu wouldn't be so silly as to shoot herself in the foot. If it wasn't Madame Zhu, then it had to be someone else. When Chu Lian thought of that strange smirk that Imperial Princess Liao had sent her earlier, she felt completely helpless inside. When Madame Zhu saw that the matriarch's gloomy expression had not changed one bit, she pleaded, "Grandmother, please don't blame Jinshui. It was someone else who stole the box from her." Matriarch He was so angry she almost took up her cane to start bashing Madame Zhu. "Do you know what time it is? If you still have the mood to plead mercy for her, then use your brains to think of a way past this problem." Matriarch He held onto her cane with both hands, chest heaving with the force of her frustration. She turned her head away from Madame Zhu. Madame Zhu's body also turned to jelly. How could she have expected such a thing to happen? If their house didn't offer up any round cakes, they would be taken to blame by the Empress and Empress Dowager. Senior servant Zhu started fretting to one side. "Matriarch, Could we borrow some round cakes from other madams to substitute for our offering? How could we borrow any? Most of the houses have already offered up their round cakes by now. Who will we borrow from? Furthermore, every estate has their own unique round cakes. How can we borrow any? Since someone was trying to teach their house Jingen a lesson from the shadows, that meant that someone was definitely watching them. If they really were to borrow someone's round cakes, then they would definitely be exposed the moment they offered the round cakes up. By then, not only would it be a disgrace to their house, it would also be a crime of deceiving the emperor. When senior servant Ju heard the matriarch's reply, she lapsed into silence. Chu Lian was almost frowning by now. This was a tough problem to resolve. Each estate had already prepared their share of round cakes. Borrowing someone else's wasn't a good solution. When matriarch he saw that Sanlang's wife was standing to one side, she was about to ask if Chu Lian had any ideas, when Madame Zhu hurriedly said, "Grandmother, sister-in-law knows how to make all sorts of confections. Why don't we let her make some round cakes from scratch? It shouldn't be too hard." When she finished speaking, both Chu Lian and matriarch he were frowning. Make them from scratch? Huh. Wasn't Madame Zhu overestimating her? Ignoring the fact that there wasn't any place for her to make confections in Ninghe Palace, even if there was one, she had never made these special mid-autumn festival round cakes before. If they didn't turn out well, wouldn't she be the one carrying all the blame and disgrace? It didn't matter if Madame Zhu was simply too confident towards her abilities or if Madame Zhu was trying to drag her down into hot water. Madame Zhu clearly didn't care for her well-being in the slightest. However, no matter what Madame Zhu thought of her in private, Chu Lian was indeed matriarch he and House Jingen's last hope at this moment. Even matriarch he held a shred of expectation in her eyes when she looked at Chu Lian. Sanlang's wife, do you have any ideas to deal with this emergency? Chu Lian shot a look at Madame Zhu. Her watery eyes made Madame Zhu feel slightly ashamed. She turned her gaze back to the matriarch and thought for a bit. She took in a deep breath and said, "Grandmother, granddaughter-in-law has thought of a solution. However, granddaughter-in-law doesn't know if it would be appropriate. As much as she didn't want to take on the responsibility for this disaster, she was already part of House Jingen now. Their names were bound together for better or for worse. Even if she wanted to take care of Madame Zhu, she couldn't risk it with this matter at hand." When matriarch he heard Chu Lian's words, she seemed to relax. She pulled Chu Lian's hands into her own and massaged them. "Good child, grandmother has let you suffer a fright. Quick, tell grandmother what your idea is." Chu Lian quickly explained her idea, but left the final decision in matriarch his hands. "Grandmother, would this solution be appropriate?" Light flickered in matriarch his astute eyes. For some strange reason, she just trusted this young granddaughter-in-law of hers. The matriarch patted Chu Lian's hands. "All right, we'll do as you say." Chu Lian didn't relax. She only turned to instruct Xian, who had followed her in, to make her preparations. When she had reached Ninghe Palace, she had also brought Xian and senior servant Gui with her. After matriarch he gave some instructions to Chu Lian, she ordered Madame Zhu, whose head was still lowered, in a cold, unforgiving tone. "Madame Zhu, you won't be needed when it's time to offer up the round cakes later. Sanlang's wife will take your place. Keep your servants close with you and stand behind me when the time comes. No one is allowed to leave before the banquet is over." This time, matriarch he was truly angry. At a grand banquet like this, it was customary for the noble madam in charge of the household to be the one presenting their offerings to the Empress Dowager and Empress. However, the matriarch had taken away that privilege of hers. This was a huge slap in her face. Following this, Madame Zhu would not be able to hold her head high in the capital for some time. This punishment was even more harsh than sending away her two trusted servants. Chapter 203, Winner 1. When matriarch he came out of the side hall with Chu Lian supporting her at one side, a handmaid who had been watching from the shadows quietly left. Matriarch he was walking with her two granddaughters-in-law behind her, when Lady Pan caught sight of them. She came over with a friendly smile and walked up to matriarch his side, bobbing in greeting. Patriarch he was about to return the greeting, but was held up by Lady Pan. Matriarch he, You're already at a grand age, please don't stand on ceremony with me. I don't see Countess Jingen with you today, how is her health now? Matriarch, his expression didn't change, as if they hadn't panicked over losing their round cakes earlier. With a calm expression, she replied in an amiable manner, I thank you for your kind thoughts in place of my daughter-in-law, Lady Pan. Her body is still a little weak, so she sent a reply to the palace a few days ago, explaining that she can't make it for the banquet. Lady Pan's gaze casually passed over the two ladies standing behind Matriarch He, before focusing on Chu Lian's young and tender face. Her smile became even warmer. This lady behind you must be your newest granddaughter-in-law? She is. Sanlang's wife may be young, but she's very sensible. Following Matriarch He's words, Chu Lian bobbed in greeting to Lady Pan. The smile on Lady Pan's face hadn't budged an inch. What great fortune you have, Matriarch He. Your granddaughter-in-law is a sensible one, and she's also a lady from House Ying. It won't be too long before you'll get to play with your great-grandson then. Lady Pan's sudden change of topic made the expressions of each of the three madams of House Jingen change. Speaking of the fertility of the ladies of House Ying was a slight to Chu Lian. Mentioning a great-grandson was to provoke Madame Zhu, who hadn't produced an heir for the family line yet. Saying that it wouldn't be too long was slapping Chu Lian and Matriarch He in the face. In the entire capital, who didn't know of the news that House Jingen's He Sanlang had entered the army just 3 days after his marriage? Without her husband at home, what did it mean if the wife was suddenly pregnant? This Lady Pan, who seemingly hadn't done any wrong on the surface, was actually a master of provocation. Matriarch He was more experienced in the end. After a spark of rage had passed through her eyes, she quickly regained her calm. Lady Pan, you're usually closed up in your estate. You probably don't know that that unfilial grandson of mine has already left to join the army at the northern border. Shock appeared on Lady Pan's face and she quickly tried to apologize. Matriarch He, it was my bad for that slip of the tongue. I hope you don't blame me. Who could have expected He Sanlang to be so resolute in leaving? Unless, her gaze shot towards Chu Lian, harboring bad intentions as she hinted at some unspeakable reason. After they had spoken for so long, some of the madams around them were starting to shoot casual glances over. Although nothing showed on their faces, their ears were pricked up to the maximum, trying to catch every word of Matriarch He and Lady Pan's conversation. Their eyes shone like vultures, seeking gossip. Lady Pan was trying to put the blame for He Chengdi's leaving on this newlywed wife of his. Although she hadn't finished her sentence, anyone with some brains could tell what she was trying to get at. Madame Zhu lowered her head. Although Lady Pan was provoking House Jingen right now, she didn't feel anger at all. Conversely, she felt delighted. Lady Pan happened to cross gazes with Chu Lian and was abruptly stunned by what she saw. Chu Lian's wide, clear eyes were looking right back at her without any hint of anger, as if she wasn't the subject of her provocation at all. What Lady Pan had done was akin to tossing a bucket of icy water on a bamboo basket. The icy water hadn't affected the basket one bit and had actually passed through the seams of the bamboo basket, making Lady Pan feel like she had failed in her attack. The two-faced Lady Pan hadn't made Chu Lian angry, but had conversely suffered some frustration herself. She stared at Chu Lian as she continued speaking. Now that He Sanlang has joined the army at the northern border, if he doesn't accrue some sort of achievement, he'll only be able to return in 5 years. What a waste of honored Lady Jeannie's best years. Chu Lian found all this rather funny inwardly. What was going on? Why was everyone targeting her? This was the first time she had ever met Lady Pan. The Pan estate was also ranks above her, so she couldn't possibly have met with them before marriage either. Why was Lady Pan suddenly at odds with her? Could it be because of Chu Chizheng's visit to the Pan estate? When she thought of this, Chu Lian's expression turned dark. She didn't ask for her father's love, but he shouldn't be dragging her down either. Many thanks for Lady Pan's kind thoughts. My husband is extremely fortunate, so he'll surely have a lucky turn of events. Chu Lian threw her neutral reply back at Lady Pan. She was too lazy to beat around the bush with this Lady Pan and couldn't be bothered to form a more politically correct response. That Lady Pan was already trying to bully her, wasn't she allowed to throw something back? Chu Lian wasn't someone who liked to hold grudges. She would rather give as good as she got on the spot. Lady Pan choked on that response. That everlasting smile on her face also disappeared slowly. She tossed one last sentence at Chu Lian coldly. I didn't expect honored Lady Genie to be so open-minded. Chu Lian tilted her head to one side and gave a dazzlingly bright smile to Lady Pan. Lady Pan's tempo had been completely messed up by Chu Lian's unexpected reply. She suddenly gave a furtive smile. Matriarch He, I haven't seen your estate's round cakes. What's going on? Are you trying to deceive the Empress Dowager? Matriarch He sent a look at Chu Lian, who held up an exquisite container and showed it off to Lady Pan. Thank you for reminding me of the round cakes, Lady Pan. I have to present them now, please excuse me. After she said so, Chu Lian took the round cakes and her maidservants with her to greet the Empress Dowager. Chapter 204, Winner, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Lady Pan stared after Chu Lian's figure in disbelief for a moment. After she regained her senses, Chu Lian had already disappeared into the crowd. Her good mood had been completely dissipated by this short conversation with them. In her frustration, she shot a look of contempt at Madame Zhu before she left, not forgetting one last provocation. When the madams around them saw that it wasn't House Jingen's eldest young madam who was to present the round cakes, there were a bunch of strange looks directed towards Madame Zhu. In an instant, Madame Zhu felt the urge to dig a hole and hide in it. By the time Chu Lian had properly presented her round cakes and returned to Matriarch's side, Royal Princess Duanjia had squeezed in beside her. She whispered in Chu Lian's ear and asked if she needed any help. Chu Lian smiled and shook her head, telling her that everything was fine. Royal Princess Duanjia's expression relaxed and she gave her a nod before leaving. The banquet was about to begin and the round cakes would be judged at the end. Royal Princess Duanjia was part of Prince Wei's estate, so she wasn't going to be seated with Chu Lian's group. By the time all the female guests were seated, the banquet officially started. Royal Princess Duanjia was sitting with Princess Wei at one of the foremost seats. Right above her were the Empress Dowager and the Empress. Imperial concubine Wei was seated below the Empress, while a few old concubines of the previous emperor were seated below the Empress Dowager. Princess Wei was ranked below the various concubines, so she was seated with the wives of the other princes. Royal Princess Duanjia was at the table next to hers, where all the princesses were seated. Imperial Princess Liao was placed diagonally across from Royal Princess Duanjia. Chu Lian was sitting beside Matriarch He, with other noble madams of the same rank. There was one more seat reserved for House Ying's matriarch here, but House Ying's matriarch hadn't come, seemingly due to health issues. Other than their matriarch, none of the madams of House Ying were qualified to enter the banquet. Thus, Chu Lian didn't see anyone from House Ying here in Ninghe Palace. When Chu Lian turned to look at Empress Shun, who was giving a speech, she felt a burning gaze like coals on her. She followed the sensation, only to meet with Imperial Princess Liao's eyes. Princess Liao was so angry that her little hands were curled into fists. She had never suffered a setback like that before. With her high and mighty status, if she wanted to teach anyone a lesson, she would be able to do so without any restraint. Even if they died in the process, no one would be able to touch her. Now, all she had been trying to do was to make trouble for brother his annoying wife. However, she kept failing to do so. She could still accept it when she had failed at the Dingyuan estate. It wasn't her territory after all. However, now that Chu Lian was in the palace, her schemes were still failing spectacularly. How could she not be angry? If she could, Imperial Princess Liao would kill Chu Lian on the spot to relieve this hatred within her. Chu Lian's gaze swept over Imperial Princess Liao once before she shifted her eyes elsewhere, as if she hadn't seen that burning hatred in the princess's eyes. Chu Lian performed perfectly at the banquet, doing everything as customary. She didn't attract anyone's attention nor did she flout any rules of etiquette. She was just waiting for the banquet to end so she could go home to Songtao Court, have a nice hot bath and then fall in bed for a good night's sleep. In the later half of the banquet, it was time for the round cakes to be judged. The offered round cakes from each estate were placed in similar silver trays. The top 10 ranked noble madams and imperial family members would then taste each one before choosing a winner. From her conversation with Royal Princess Duanjia earlier, Chu Lian knew that this competition wasn't as fair as most people would think. The round cakes that she had submitted were also a little different from most, so she wasn't too worried about being chosen as the winner. She just sat calmly and ate while watching the show. Although the food for this imperial banquet wasn't too tasty, the fruits offered after the main meal were delicious. They were serving dragon fruits and mangosteens that were part of the tributes from the western regions. They never had a chance to taste these in the Jing'an estate. It was unexpected that the Empress Dowager would bring these rare fruits out for her guests at this banquet. The round cake competition was at its peak when the eunuch guarding the entrance at Ninghe Palace suddenly announced, "The Emperor has arrived." Normally, the Emperor wouldn't come to Ninghe Palace. In previous years, it had always been either the Empress Dowager or the Empress hosting banquets like this. Their guests would also be the ladies of the noble houses. In the past 2 years, the Chengping Emperor had never come to grace the mid-autumn banquet. However, since he was here now, the crowd was naturally happy to see him. They didn't have much chance to peek at the face of the almighty emperor on normal days. The Chengping Emperor had purely come over for a change of pace after facing boredom in his imperial study. He hadn't arranged this visit in advance. He happened to chance upon the judging of the round cakes, so he joined the judges since he was in a good mood. The banquet became even more lively after the arrival of the emperor. In a short moment, the judging was over. The scroll with the result was passed to one of the court ladies who served in the Empress Dowager's palace. The Chengping Emperor was seated next to the Empress Dowager as he chatted warmly with her, all the while listening to the court lady announce the winner of this year's round cake competition. The announcer's voice was bright and clear, covering the entire hall in an instant. The madams seated at the same table as Lady Pan were already smiling and congratulating her in low voices, without waiting for the announcer to finish speaking. Lady Pan was also full of pleasant smiles upon receiving their congratulations. A nice warmth settled in her heart. The announcer's voice rang out in the hall. After the judge's appraisal, the winner of this year's competition is House Jing'an. Chapter 205, Not Accepting the Loss. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian had been in the middle of leisurely drinking some 9-flower honey water that a palace servant had poured out for her. The moment she heard that announcement, she almost choked on the water and ended up coughing intensely. What? How could the winner of the competition be House Jing'an? Fortunately, they were seated far away from the main center of attention, so her moment of inelegance hadn't been noticed by many. Xian quickly passed a handkerchief over to Chu Lian, worriedly whispering a question into her ear. "Third young madam, are you all right?" Chu Lian waved her hand, indicating that she was fine. By this time, most of the noble madams had turned to look in the direction of House Jing'an's ladies. After a moment's pause, some noble madams started giving their congratulations to Matriarch He. Matriarch He had been stunned for a few seconds. However, she reacted just in time to lead her 2 granddaughters-in-law in graciously accepting the congratulations headed their way. Lady Pan was seated at a table right in front of them. Sharing her table was the wife of one of her husband's colleagues in court, Lady Yang. Lady Pan's table was currently frozen in the midst of an awkward atmosphere. Just now, before the court lady had started announcing the winner, the madams at this table had already started congratulating Lady Pan. However, now that the winner wasn't the Pan estate, their words had turned into slaps on Lady Pan's face. Each of the madams who had spoken up too early all had their heads lowered and their mouths tightly shut. They were trying their best to disappear into the ground. Only Lady Yang remained calm with a smile on her face. Lady Pan's warm and ever-friendly face had lost its modest and amiable air, and was currently as black as the bottom of a pot. She looked up at the main seats in the hall in disbelief. Everything had been arranged beforehand. How had everything changed just like that? How could it be House Jing'an that had won? Unable to hold back her rage, she stood up and took in a few deep breaths before she could manage to bring out a smile. She turned to the table that Matriarch He was seated at and said, "Matriarch He, that's quite the talent you've hidden away. I wonder if I might have the luck to taste the round cakes you've offered up today? Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. However, matriarch he was the most senior member of the family present right now, so it wasn't her place to speak as a granddaughter-in-law. Lady Yang also stood up. However, she didn't say a word and simply continued looking in the direction of House Jing'an with a smile in her eyes. When she looked at Chu Lian, her expression turned especially warm and kind. Lady Pan refused to believe that House Jing'an's round cakes had managed to win the competition. The others might still be in the dark, but she knew for a fact that House Jing'an's round cakes had been stolen away by someone when they had entered Ninghe Palace. If some random replacement cakes from who knows where could win the competition, it would be a slap in the face to all the noble participants here. She was going to expose House Jing'an's tricks today, right in front of the Emperor. Let's see how they'll be able to hold their head up high in the capital from now on. Imperial concubine Wei was seated diagonally across from the tables where all the noble titled ladies were. She happened to glance over curiously at the area where House Jing'an's table was situated. When she saw that some noble madams had stood up and seemed to be fighting, the corners of her eyes tilted upwards in a subtle display of her inner joy. If they didn't start fighting by now, that would have been a waste of this whole play she had arranged. When the Chengping Emperor cast his gaze sideways, he noticed that Imperial concubine Wei's expression was all smiles. He took up his wine cup for a sip, using that movement to follow where her gaze was directed at. He suddenly spoke up, "Concubine, it seems like you're rather happy today." Imperial concubine Wei froze for a moment before quickly discarding the out-of-place expression on her face. She replied in a coquettish manner, "Your Majesty, this lovely mid-autumn festival only comes around once a year. How could your humble concubine not be joyous?" The Chengping Emperor turned his gaze onto her and set down his wine cup, uttering an ambiguous, "Is it so?" in reply. "Of course, how could your humble concubine dare to deceive your Majesty?" Royal Princess Duanjia had also noticed the commotion. When she saw that Chu Lian seemed to be in trouble, she quickly stood up, wanting to go over to help. However, she was held back by Princess Wei. "Mother, don't stop me, I want to go over to take a look. That idiot Chu Liu is getting bullied again." Princess Wei glared at her. "You're forbidden from going there. If you go there now, you'll just be adding to the trouble. Jeannie isn't as stupid as you might think. If she really didn't have a way to deal with them, she would naturally have sent someone to us for help. But, no buts. Stay here and watch. Who knows if the bully will end up getting their way." After Princess Wei had given her orders, Royal Princess Duanjia could only sit down and watch the situation over there with a face full of anxiety. Matriarch he had been socializing for years with these noble madams since she was a young lady herself. So of course she wasn't someone to be bullied so easily. Lady Pan's forceful request to take a look at House Jing'an's round cakes had clearly come out of her disbelief that they could win the competition, and she was clearly looking to make some trouble for them. When Matriarch he noticed the confidence in Lady Pan's expression, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. That mysterious attacker who had stolen away their estate's round cakes definitely had something to do with this Lady Pan. Although Matriarch he was already getting on in age and her hair was completely white, her eyes were still sharp and she still had her wits about her. Matriarch he didn't back down one bit. Instead, it was Madame Zhu who shrunk back upon facing the eyes of all the other noble madams around them. She shuffled behind the matriarch in an attempt to hide herself. She had completely forgotten her jealousy of Chu Lian taking her place to offer up the round cakes, and was simply relieved that this had nothing to do with her. Chu Lian was standing by Matriarch's side and holding onto her arm. When she saw that Matriarch he hadn't backed down and had even straightened up, Chu Lian felt like she had grown a few inches taller. "Lady Pan, are you purposely trying to trouble this old woman? The round cakes have already been offered up to the Empress Dowager. If Lady Pan would like to taste them, then I'm afraid you'll have to ask for that favor from the Empress Dowager herself." Chapter 206, Not Accepting the Loss, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Lady Pan was so enraged that her hands had started trembling, hidden under the broad sleeves of her court dress. She tossed her sleeves and left the banquet area. When she reached the platform where the esteemed personages were seated, she bowed towards the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager was already old, so she couldn't see clearly the person who had just walked up to the bottom of the platform and greeted her. It was a court lady at the side who quickly informed her of the person's identity. "Lady Pan, what business do you have?" Although Empress Shen didn't know what had happened behind the scenes at the banquet today, she was happy to watch the drama unfold. She continued looking upon the scene before her with her eyebrows raised. When Lady Pan heard the Empress Dowager personally replying her excitement sparked. She replied respectfully, "Replying to your grace, for the sake of the Mid-Autumn Banquet's round cake competition, your humble servant started researching on new recipes for round cakes half a year ago. Thus, it's quite hard for your humble servant to accept today's loss. Might your grace be inclined to favor your humble servant with some of the winning round cakes of this year's competition? Your humble servant will be able to rest easy upon tasting them." Lady Pan had a distinguished and powerful background, so she was able to speak so freely to the Empress Dowager. If it had been any other courtier's wife who had dared to cast even the slightest bit of doubt on the Empress Dowager's decision, they would have been accused of the crime of lèse majesté. However, even if it was Lady Pan who had brought forth such a request, her actions were still slightly inappropriate. When the Empress Dowager heard the reason for this request, her expression turned stormy. Actually, the Empress Dowager couldn't care less for the judging of the round cakes. In her old age, she had simply wanted to enjoy some lively festivities at the Mid-Autumn Banquet. However, this doubting of her judgment had caused her mood to turn sour. Although the Empress Dowager didn't take Lady Pan to blame for her request, her voice had lost all traces of kindness when she replied, "Since that is so, I'll let you satisfy your uneasiness. Go, bring over House Jingen's round cakes and let all the noble madams try some." The court lady-in-waiting serving the Empress Dowager bobbed in acknowledgement before quickly leading away two handmaids to the area where the round cakes were on display. The Chengping Emperor sat at the highest seat, casting his gaze on the proceedings below him without any change in expression, as if he hadn't been the one to pick the winner of the round cake competition. When Lady Pan heard that the Empress Dowager had actually acquiesced to her request, she immediately relaxed. She turned to look in the direction of House Jingen's ladies with a disdainful glare, as if she had already seen their terrible end. The court lady serving the Empress Dowager was conscientious in her work. She split House Jingen's round cakes into many portions and had them placed in pure white porcelain dishes. She then instructed a few handmaids to serve them up to Lady Pan, as well as the Emperor, his wives, and the extended imperial family. A handmaid brought the porcelain dish up to Lady Pan's side. She knelt down and said, "Noble madam, this is today's winning round cakes. Please have a taste." When the handmaid finished speaking, the noble madams around her had already focused their gazes on the dish in her hands. When they looked at the confection offered up on that porcelain dish, they drew in their breaths in surprise. It was a round confection with a flowery pattern on top. The edges were repeating waves that formed a flower, while an exquisite fortune word was carved into the pastry skin that had been baked into a beautiful golden brown. Each piece was only about the size of half an egg and there were 5 in the dish. Impossible. How could there be such a complicated pattern on such a small piece of confection? The amount of detail on it was comparable to a piece of embroidery. Even before the noble madams had taken a single bite, their attention had already been stolen away by the exquisiteness of the pastries. Madame Zhu stared at that small dish of confections in disbelief. Where had these beautiful confections come from? Why hadn't she seen or known of these before? When her mind led her to this thought, she abruptly turned to Chu Lian, who was standing next to Matriarch He. It was her. It was her younger sister-in-law again. Actually, Matriarch He hadn't seen Chu Lian's replacements for the round cakes either, so her heart had been beating like a drum in her chest. Upon seeing the confections for herself, half of the anxiety in her heart eased away. She turned to Chu Lian with a warm gaze, and Chu Lian returned it with a faint smile. However, Lady Pan's expression had turned for the worse. She picked up one of the offered pastries with a trembling hand. When she bit through the pastry skin, there was some soft stuffing inside that looked translucent. She couldn't tell what it was made of, but it was similar to the stuffing in round cakes. There was even a thin layer of sweetened bean paste in the center. The pastry was very small, so you wouldn't feel very full after eating one. The soft skin broke easily while the stuffing within was slightly sweet and sticky with a hint of the fragrance of red beans. After finishing off one piece, even Lady Pan felt like taking up one more piece from the dish. It was only when she had reached her hand out that she remembered what she had set out to do. She gulped the saliva that had pooled in her mouth from eating House Jingen's round cake. Although she wasn't willing to admit it, the truth was staring her in the face. Furthermore, everyone was about to get a chance to taste House Jingen's round cakes, and the voices of the people would decide this match. She couldn't refute the judgment any further. After Lady Pan had taken a mooncake, Lady Yang had immediately taken one for herself as well. After eating it up, she shot a satisfied look over at Chu Lian. The remaining mooncakes were split between the other noble madams, who all voiced their praise for the confections. Princess Wei's table had also been given some mooncakes. When Royal Princess Duanjia looked at the confection placed before her mother, she commented on what she found strange about it. This pastry. Isn't this the same one I took from Chu Liu in the Imperial Gardens? Chu Liu told me these were called mooncakes or something. How did they turn into round cakes? Oh, mooncakes. Millimeter. Chu Liu said so. But whatever they're called, they're really delicious. Mother, try it now. The one I ate had some salty egg yolk inside. Princess Wei smiled and bit into that exquisite little mooncake. This one was actually salty. There was ham in the stuffing. Wonderful. It suited her tastes exactly. In the grand hall of Ninghe Palace, everyone who had eaten House Jingen's round cakes stared at Lady Pan with strange looks. Lady Pan had been completely disgraced today. She took the initiative to step up to the Empress Dowager and admit her wrong. As the banquet continued, she didn't say a single word. When the banquet ended, she led her servants away with her and quickly left the palace. It seemed like she wouldn't be bothering to make some small talk after the banquet today. Chapter 207, A Request from Old Duchess Zheng. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Since House Jingen's round cakes had won the competition, matriarch he was surrounded by all the noble ladies who wanted to congratulate her on the win. The Empress Dowager even specially awarded her with a sapphire headdress, adding on to House Jingen's glory at the event. Even after so many years, matriarch he had never enjoyed such attention in the palace before. Of course she was in an extremely good mood now. Chu Lian kept by her grandmother's side, so there were many questions directed towards her by the noble ladies around them. Since matriarch he had the intention of introducing her to the others, Chu Lian took the chance to get acquainted with a number of noble madams in the capital. When it was time to leave the palace, Princess Wei specially sent one of her court ladies over to invite her over to Prince Wei's estate to play in a few days, thus drawing another wave of envy from the ladies gathered. When they finally reached House Jingen's carriage, Chu Lian was about to help matriarch he up the carriage when they were hailed by an elderly madam who had come rushing over from behind. This elderly madam was no stranger. It was old Duchess Zheng. There was a middle-aged lady following next to the old Duchess, who was slightly chubby. When she smiled, her eyes morphed into upturned crescents, giving her a friendly appearance. Old sister, please hold on. Matriarch he turned around only to see her old friend. She smiled in welcome. We're sisters, the two of us. Why the rush? Walk a little slower, and be careful not to strain your waist. Old Duchess Zheng came over with a wide smile. When she reached matriarch his side, she first smiled at Chu Lian before talking to the matriarch. I have come looking for old sister for a certain matter. There's no need to be so courteous between us. Just say it straight. Matriarch he answered generously. Old Duchess Zheng was about to speak of her matter when Chu Lian caught sight of some people who had just exited the palace behind them. That person with a round face and slender brows, wasn't that Lady Pan? Hadn't she left the banquet early on? Why was she only exiting the palace at this hour? Chu Lian's brows drew together in a slight frown. They had offended Lady Pan today, so she was afraid that they would get into a quarrel if they bumped into each other now. She spoke up with a suggestion. Grandmother, There are many people coming and going from the palace entrance here. How about chatting inside the carriage instead? It might be more comfortable for grandmother and old Duchess Zheng. Matriarch he had clearly spotted Lady Pan on the way out of the palace with her group of servants in tow. Thus, she invited old Duchess Zheng onto House Jingen's wide carriage and they boarded together. Although the carriage was quite spacious, it wasn't meant to be a room after all. When all four of them entered, it became a little cramped. Madame Zhu had just lifted the curtain and was about to enter, when Matriarch he spoke to her. Darlang's wife, the carriage is a little cramped. Go to the other carriage at the back instead. The hand that Madame Zhu was using to hold up the carriage curtain clenched. She looked up at the four people seated in the carriage before bowing slightly to Matriarch he and leaving for the other carriage. Chu Lian glanced at Madame Zhu's departing figure and sighed inwardly. The distance between them had still increased in the end. Her eldest sister-in-law was already looking at her through tinted glasses. From now on, no matter what she did, Madame Zhu would probably look badly on her. Chu Lian wasn't one to go seeking trouble if no one tried to attack her. Although she didn't like squabbling over petty matters, she wasn't one to sit back and let others take her to task either. In the future, she and Madame Zhu would be like a well and a river. Their waters were not to seep and mix into each other. Duke Zheng's estate wasn't far from Count Jingen's estate. They would be taking the same route along Zhuqiu Avenue for some time anyway, so this was a convenient time for them to talk. With House Zheng's carriage following behind, the two old sisters chatted in House Jingen's carriage with a lively air. Old Duchess Zheng had also seen something fishy in the events at the banquet. She held on to Matriarch's hand and reassured her, it's not uncommon for things like that to happen when it comes to such a big occasion. It's fine as long as you've made it out safely. Matriarch he nodded and smiled at old Duchess Zheng. Oh you. Stop thinking about that. Hasn't our house benefited from that unfortunate turn of events? Old Duchess Zheng smiled and looked at Chu Lian. After tasting those round cakes, I just knew it was your young lady's idea. Since Sanlang isn't at home, you probably don't have much to do in your estate. Come to the Zheng estate with your grandmother some other time. Chu Lian was slightly surprised. She hadn't thought that old Duchess Zheng would take the initiative to give her an invite to her estate. In the original story, this old madam was like a hermit. She would only socialize with the few madams she had befriended in her younger days. Chu Lian turned to Matriarch he. For a matter like this, it was better for Matriarch he to make decision for her as the senior member of her family. Matriarch he was very satisfied with Chu Lian's action. She playfully rebuked her old friend, I think you just want to taste my granddaughter-in-law's culinary skills for yourself. Inviting her to have some fun is just a pretense. Even though old Duchess Zheng and Matriarch he had already been close friends for a few decades, when she heard Matriarch he exposing her ploy, she still blushed a little. She sighed lightly, I'm not going to hide things from you. I've brought my daughter-in-law along with a request. Chu Lian found it strange. Duke Zheng had a very successful career and their only heir was in the Imperial College. In the coming autumn examinations, he would definitely be able to score in the higher ranks. It could be said that all things were going smoothly for House Zheng. Why then, did old Duchess Zheng need to request help from Matriarch he? Even if she were to request for help, something that troubled House Zheng was likely something that Matriarch he wouldn't be able to help with. Although Matriarch he was highly regarded in their social circles and was even close friends with the Empress Dowager, she didn't have the power to interfere with the court. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Chu Lian's mind, which rendered her speechless. Do speak directly. As long as it's something within my means, I'll do my best to help. Old Duchess Zheng shot a sideways look at Matriarch he and seemed a little tongue-tied. When the younger Duchess Zheng saw that her mother-in-law was too embarrassed to speak up, she helped her out by saying, Matriarch he, the matter is like this. Chapter 208, A Request from Duchess Zheng, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. When Matriarch he heard her explanation, she was stunned. She couldn't have imagined that the problem laid with old Duke Zheng. Apparently, he was currently bedridden and refusing food and drink. Those close to House Zheng knew that old Duke Zheng was a glutton for food. He had visited most of the top-ranked restaurants in the capital. Ever since he had passed the Duke's seat to his heir, old Duke Zheng would travel far and wide every day to search for any and all gourmet food. He had recently returned home 2 months ago, but for some reason, he had completely lost his appetite. It was almost to the point that old Duke Zheng was refusing to eat any food at all. When the reason behind her request was revealed, the two Duchesses Zheng looked at Chu Lian with hope in their eyes. Chu Lian felt a little embarrassed to be the focus of their expectant stares. Matriarch, he hadn't thought that old Duchess Zheng's request would turn out to be something like this. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Her only choice was to tell the truth. Old sister, I know that you're worried for old Duke Zheng. I'll just speak honestly with you. Sanlang's wife does know how to make some interesting new dishes, but we can't promise that we'll be able to solve your problem for you. We can only say that Sanlang's wife will try her best. Of course. As long as honored Lady Jeannie is willing to help out, I'll be endlessly grateful. We have simply run out of ideas. The old man isn't willing to eat anything at all. If this continues, his body won't be able to hold on. It was clear by her tone that old Duchess Zheng was anxious. After they had finally gotten Chu Lian's agreement as well as Matriarch's promise to help with old Duchess Zheng's request, they set the date to come visit the Zheng estate for 3 days later. Chu Lian wanted to hide her face in her hands, but she honestly didn't know whether it was to start sobbing or laughing her heart out. In the original story, old Duke Zheng had passed away about 2 months from now. Had the cause of his death truly been from refusing food after being unable to taste the gourmet flavors he craved for? When they reached the point where their paths home diverged, old Duchess Zheng bid her farewells and led her daughter-in-law back to their own carriage. Now only Matriarch He and Chu Lian were left in the carriage. Matriarch He gently petted Chu Lian's fair, tender hand. Liana, you've done us a great service today. Otherwise, our house would have completely lost its reputation. Chu Lian realized that the matriarch liked to call her Liana when they were talking in private. She smiled and said, "Grandmother, don't say that. I'm also a part of House Jingen. I was just doing my part for our house." When she heard Chu Lian's answer, Matriarch He was even more gratified. "You silly child. It's been hard for you. It's not all your eldest sister-in-law's fault today, so don't hold a grudge against her. Grandmother knows that it's not easy for her either." Chu Lian felt a slight pang of shock. She hadn't expected the matriarch to think that she might hold a grudge. "We're all one big family. What is there to hold a grudge over? Eldest sister-in-law couldn't have known that she would lose the round cakes like that. We still need eldest sister-in-law to manage our household in the future. Grandmother knows. Your eldest sister-in-law has been treating you too harshly recently. Don't worry, grandmother will remind her of her duties." Chu Lian tried her best to suppress the fright in her heart. She didn't realize that Matriarch He had those sorts of thoughts in her mind. Did she think that Chu Lian had come out to save the day and bring glory to the family just to slap Madame Zhu in the face for mistreating her? Chu Lian inwardly sighed. The fatigue of the day was starting to catch up with her. No wonder the older generations liked to say that communication was key. Chu Lian felt that clearing the misunderstanding with Matriarch He right now would be better than letting it persist and affect her later on. Chu Lian looked up at the matriarch. Her almond-shaped eyes shone with intelligence under the dim lighting of the lanterns within the carriage. "Grandmother, there's an order of seniority in the family. It was granddaughter-in-law's fortune to be able to marry into the He family. Granddaughter-in-law doesn't have much ambition or talent, and would just like to live out peaceful days full of making delicious food. If it earns some income, then that's even better. Granddaughter-in-law is very lazy. After doing all these things, granddaughter-in-law would rather take a nap in the courtyard or give grandmother some company. Although Sanlang is from the main line of inheritance, he's the third son after all. There are 2 older brothers above him, and granddaughter-in-law naturally ranks the lowest in this family. Eventually, we might even have a second sister-in-law joining the family." What Chu Lian wanted to say was that she really didn't want to be in control of the household, and she didn't have any intention at all to oust eldest brother-in-law or eldest sister-in-law from their places in the family. As she watched the young girl before her making such a clear case for herself, Matriarch, his sharp eyes grew ever brighter. In the end, she sighed and patted Chu Lian's hand. Grandmother has blamed you unjustly. Chu Lian was finally able to relax. Everything that she had just said were her true thoughts. It was better to be a layabouts. Who would want to crack their brains thinking about how to support a noble house all day? As well as trying to figure out how to best socialize with the various other noble houses in the capital. Chu Lian smiled and shook her head. I don't blame grandmother. Our hearts are all hidden in our chests. Even the wisest man wouldn't be able to see into human hearts. Granddaughter-in-law just hopes that grandmother can voice out any problems first, rather than keeping it inside. Granddaughter-in-law will definitely change for the better. Being frank and sincere, as well as opening your heart, was the best way to communicate. Chu Lian had no desire to play twisted mind games with others. Matriarch, he found that she was starting to like this granddaughter-in-law of hers even more, after this honest talk with her in the carriage. She reached out to poke Chu Lian in the forehead. You silly girl. Don't think that grandmother can't see through your thoughts. You just want to laze at home all day. Although your eldest sister-in-law is around to take care of the family, you can't be too lazy either, since you're the lady in charge for your branch of the family. In the future, when all of us seniors aren't around anymore, you and Sanlang will have to separate your branch of the family and live on your own. If you don't know how to do anything at all, how are you going to manage your own house in the future? After Chu Lian had cleared away the doubts in Matriarch's heart, she started to act cutely like a child towards the Matriarch. Matriarch, he was the first senior who had treated her well since she had come to the Great Wu dynasty, so she had already taken this affable old woman to be her real grandmother in her heart. She leaned against Matriarch's side and playfully replied, but grandmother will still be around to help granddaughter-in-law out Tilda. When Sanlang and I leave the estate to create our own household, grandmother has to come along, too. Otherwise, granddaughter-in-law won't be able to manage a household on her own. The servants will make fun of me then. You little imp. Since you already know that, why are you still trying to think of ways to skive off all day? Chapter 209, An Old Matriarch's Worries. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Even though Matriarch he said that, she knew that Sanlang's wife wasn't stupid. She had been watching Sanlang's wife this whole time. Perhaps she really was a lazy bones and didn't like to manage others. However, her little courtyard was managed very well. It was clear that Chu Lian just didn't like to work. Why had she been so wary of this lazy little imp trying to steal the main branch's authority? She was really getting on in her years if she hadn't even been able to recognize Chu Lian's true nature. All right. All you know how to do is act like a spoilt child. Wait until Sanlang comes back, then you can use that act on him instead. Grandmother's heart can't take your silliness anymore. Oh yes, what about that restaurant grandmother gave to you? How is it doing now? Chu Lian chuckled and sat up straight again before she replied, Don't worry, grandmother. Granddaughter-in-law has already made some arrangements. We'll be able to reopen in a few more days. By then, grandmother has to help granddaughter-in-law out and grace the restaurant with your illustrious presence. When her thoughts led to the restaurant, something else had the matriarch worrying all over again. The title of Count Jingen was surely going to be passed down to Dalang. Sanlang had left so hurriedly for the northern border. Who knew if he would be able to make a name for himself out there? Although Sanlang's wife was a good child, with Haoxing as her background, she surely didn't have much money at hand now. How was she supposed to maintain her own household in the future? She only hoped that this young girl could really make something out of Guilin restaurant again. She didn't hope for Chu Lian to earn tons of gold. It would be good enough if she could have at least a meager source of income for her household. That way, when Sanlang returned in a few more years, the couple would have a nice nest egg. As long as matriarch he helped out by adding some gold here and there, their lives wouldn't be too poor. Now there was only that disappointing brat, Erlang, who still refused to marry. Matriarch he had to keep some money in reserve for him as well. With so many areas to fund, as full as her purse might be now, it was slowly being slimmed further and further. Her daughter-in-law's medicine fees would still have to be drawn from the shared household funds, too. That would be a humongous expense. When she thought of this, Matriarch he started feeling overwhelmed by all her worries. To most people, it might look like a bed of roses to be a member of a noble house. However, if the noble house didn't have someone who knew how to earn money, then searching for sources of income was a massive headache on its own. When Matriarch he was younger and in charge of the he household, she had managed to save up a good amount of money for her personal funds. She could be considered a rather wise matriarch from this action alone. However, she still wasn't all that good at business, and she had only managed to keep the properties in her hands running as per usual, rather than improving them somehow. Later on, when she passed on the household management to her daughter-in-law, Countess Jingen hadn't been in charge for long. She had given birth to her 3 sons during those years and hurt her body. The household management rights had been passed back to Matriarch He. It wasn't until Madame Zhu had married into the family that the rights had passed into her hands. However, Madame Zhu was even worse at making money than Matriarch He, so it was good enough that their stores had even been able to continue operating as usual. If not for the fact that Matriarch He had trained up some loyal managers in her younger days and kept them in charge of the family properties, most of their businesses would probably be in the same state as Guilin Restaurant. House Jingen didn't have much spare income, and it was impossible for Madame Zhu to expect any extra money from her mother-in-law, Madame Liu. Her dowry had all been used for her own medicine. Although Matriarch He did contribute some funds to the household from time to time, she had to keep enough for her grandsons as well, so she didn't give much. Madame Zhu hadn't been able to give Dalang any heirs for so many years, so she put all her heart into managing the household to assuage her inner guilt. Sometimes, when the household expenses exceeded the monthly budget, she would use her own personal funds to cover the difference. However, this wasn't a long-term solution. Madame Zhu's personal funds weren't unlimited. Erlang was serving in the Dragon Guards and didn't come home much. He practically wasn't involved with managing the household at all. Dalang had gotten a slack position. Although he tried his best to support the Jingen estate, he was still a military man to his core, just like his father, Count Jingen. He looked down upon merchants and their sneaky ways, so he rarely bothered with helping to increase the estate's income. The men of the He family were all hotheads. Although they didn't spend much, they didn't think to make more money for the family either. This had the ladies of the Jingen estate racking their brains for ways to keep their household afloat. If they had more clan members like the other noble families did, they would still be alright. If the main branch wasn't good at business, then they still had the other branches to support the family. However, Count Jingen was the only son, and their ancestors had mostly been single sons as well. Old Count Jingen had a brother, but he had died on the battlefield, leaving behind a single daughter. That daughter had gotten married, but she died in the 2nd year of marriage due to a difficult birth, and they hadn't managed to save her child, either. It was only when they reached He Changdi's generation that they had miraculously gotten 3 sons in the same generation. This was also why Matriarch He still favored and respected Madame Liu even though she had gotten injured while giving birth to He Changdi and was now mostly bedridden. Madame Liu had helped the He family spread their family tree. However, who could have expected that their youngest generation would cause them so much worry? The eldest son's wife hadn't been able to give birth to a male heir despite close to 10 years of marriage. The second son refused to marry. Worried for Sanlang's future, Matriarch He had been forced to plead the Empress Dowager to bestow an engagement to a lady of House Ying for He Changdi. Now that she thought about it, after so many years, that decision was the best one she had ever made. Chapter 210, An Old Matriarch's Worries, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Although the matriarch was deep in thought, in reality, not too much time had passed. Chu Lian noticed how occupied Matriarch He was and didn't disturb her. Suddenly, Matriarch His eyes caught sight of a brocade box placed to the side. This was the sapphire headdress that the Empress Dowager had awarded them for winning the round cake competition. Her expression changed slightly and she turned to look at Chu Lian. Her young granddaughter-in-law's eyes were fluttering as she fought the urge to sleep. Her head was shaking as she was close to nodding off. The worry in Matriarch His heart eased away for a moment. This child was just a carefree one, never taking anything to heart. Something that would draw the average person's attention was no more than background decoration to her. She really wondered how Hao Xing had managed to bring up a lady with this kind of personality. Sanlang's wife. Wake up. After calling once without receiving a reply, in fact, Chu Lian's head was about to hit the wall of the carriage matriarch. He found the situation was actually rather funny. She reached out and lightly poked her sleepy granddaughter-in-law. Chu Lian jolted awake. It had been a tiring day for her, after all. Her nerves had been tightly wound all day, and it was only now that she finally got the chance to relax. Her eyelids were struggling to stay open. Ah! Grandmother, what's wrong? Are we home yet? Matriarch he purposely put on a strict expression as she said, What do you mean, are we home yet? There's still a long way to go. Chu Lian's shoulders drooped. It's too tiring to enter the palace. Grandmother, please don't bring granddaughter-in-law here next time. Granddaughter-in-law prefers to sleep at home and cook. Matriarch he patted Chu Lian's slender shoulders a little helplessly. You're really a lazy little imp. All right, drink some tea to help your mind stay awake. We don't even have a blanket in this carriage, so you can't sleep. It won't be good if you catch a cold. We're almost home, so hang in there for a while longer. Chu Lian slapped her own cheeks and managed to chase away some of her sleepiness. When she turned and saw that matriarch he was still watching her with no small degree of amusement, she tilted her head to the side and asked, Does grandmother have something else to say? When matriarch his eyes met with the bright, clear eyes of Sanlang's wife, she felt a mysterious comfort soothe her heart. She nodded and pointed at the brocade box in the corner. Liana, who do you think this headdress should belong to? Chu Lian cast a sideways glance at the brocade box before remembering that this was the sapphire headdress that the Empress Dowager had awarded to them. She wasn't all that interested in accessories. She would simply wear some normal ones usually, and she wasn't very picky with them. Furthermore, she had managed to peek at the headdress when the Empress Dowager had awarded it to them. It was indeed an exquisite, expensive-looking ornament. However, perhaps due to the passing of time, the style it was made in was a little old, and it didn't suit a young girl like her. Matriarch he was watching Chu Lian. When her eyes drifted to the brocade box, her expression had remained unchanged as if the contents didn't attract her one bit. The matriarch was satisfied with this reaction. Granddaughter-in-law feels that this headdress should be given to eldest sister-in-law. Eldest sister-in-law has also suffered no small amount of fright today. Chu Lian said with a smile. As much as she had already lost all interest in making friends with Madame Zhu, since matriarch he was clearly expecting her to say something along those lines, then she would go along with her wishes. Anyway, matriarch he was still going to be the one in charge of determining the recipient of the headdress. She knew that matriarch he would still give it to Madame Zhu in the end, no matter what she said. Since the stage was already set like this, why go against the flow? Actually, Chu Lian didn't really care. Anyway, it wouldn't end up in her hands anyway, so it didn't matter who got it. And since it was a gift from the Empress Dowager, they couldn't even sell it for money, anyway. Getting it was the same as getting a pretty decoration to occasionally admire. As expected, matriarch his smile turned softer. Good child, you're starting to think along the same lines as grandmother now. Chu Lian was as thick-skinned as they came. After receiving matriarch his praise, she didn't blush at all. She even smiled from ear to ear, showing off her pearly white teeth. When they returned to the Jing'an estate, matriarch he instructed her to return to her courtyard to rest. She was still in the middle of growing, after all. Chu Lian didn't stand on courtesy. Rather than refusing the offer, she declined to send matriarch he back to her own courtyard, and let Xian help her back to Songtao Court. She had gone out in the morning and only arrived back when it was dark. Chu Lian had zero energy left after this exhausting day. Wenqing even had to be on standby to help her while she bathed. Chu Lian climbed onto the bed and burrowed under her blankets. It wasn't long before she fell asleep. Senior servant Gui was both gratified and sympathetic to her plight. She pulled the covers over Chu Lian before ordering Jingyan to keep watch over her. It was only then that she returned to her own room to rest. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.